Hello and welcome to Uncommon Ground with me, Justin Briley. Conversations matter, and this is the show where we bring together great minds who see the world differently to explore faith, science, philosophy and culture, all recorded here in the beautiful setting of Yarnton Manor, Oxford. My guests today are Alex O'Connor and Glen Scrivener. Alex is a YouTuber, writer and host of the Within Reason podcast with over 1.5 million subscribers online. We're just a short way behind you there, Alex, at the moment, but trying to catch up.
You'll get there.
Glen is the director of Speak Life and author of the book, The Air We Breathe, How We All Came to Believe in Freedom, Kindness, Progress and Equality. So glad to have you both with me today, folks. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
I'm looking forward to discussing our question. Did Christian faith give us our belief in kindness, equality, freedom and consent? Whether we get to all of those remains to be seen in the time we've got. But this has been kind of something that I've been sort of really excited about, anticipating. We have lunch just before we come through and already the conversation was buzzing. In that case on panpsychism of all things, but we're not going to do that today. We're going to do kind of culture, history, Christianity, ethics, morals. But your star has just feels like it's risen to new heights over the last couple of years, Alex. Why are people so interested in everything you have to say?
I don't know, Justin. I love it. I'm very grateful for it. I think because I get obsessed with these subjects, like with panpsychism. My friends who tell me that I'm obsessed with myself. I talk about myself too much. And I think that's true if you put a space between them. I am obsessed with the concept of the self at the moment. I get so interested that I just try to sort of spill enthusiasm out. And because I'm mostly interviewing other people, I'm right there with them. I'm just listening to Ian McGilchrist talking about like split brains. And I'm like, this is the most incredible thing I've ever heard. And I suppose I'm sort of sharing in that excitement.
It is kind of infectious, actually, the way you share your interest. It definitely comes through the screen to the people, and I think in a way that's what people want. They just want to be in the midst of interesting conversations. That's kind of what we're trying to do here.
You need to just remind people that there's so much. What is it that Chesterton said, that the world doesn't suffer for lack of wonders but lack of wonder?
Mm-hmm.
It's so easy to just be amazed by anything in this room, and you just need somebody, usually a podcast guest or someone like that, to show you where to look,
point it out. Brilliant. Glen, you've been interested in a lot of what Alex has been putting out in the last couple of years. Where has that come from?
I think he might be my favorite YouTuber. So it's been a great privilege to meet you finally in the flesh. I think, there is something of an ebullience to Alex, and I think there's something of a crystal clarity. I'm not surprised that you resonate with Chesterton, because I see that sort of impish Chestertonian delight in what is under our nose and noticing what is under our nose that other people hadn't noticed before.
Not to mention the drinking and the smoking.
All of that will catch up with you. But no, I've loved listening to Alex over the years, and I think our interests intersect in lots of different ways about philosophy and faith. So yeah,
good stuff. Well, I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of specifics over the course of this hour or two that we're recording here. We do something a bit different on this new show, Uncommon Ground. It's sort of an exercise in empathy, if you will, but essentially just to make sure we do recognise at least where we're both coming from, mutual understanding. So what we ask our guests to do is to essentially try to summarise as best they can the viewpoint on this question, this subject, of their opposite number. So, Alex, I wonder if you could have a go, and there might be some back and forth in this, giving us a sense of what you believe Glen's position is on this whole question of where we got our morality from in the 21st century West.
It seems to me that Glen is proposing what has come to be quite a popular view at the moment, especially among Christians, but also among some secular historians, that Western civilization, warts and all, as it were, the good stuff, the bad stuff, just the nature of the West, is more thoroughly indebted to Christianity than at least has been given credit for in the past, sort of 100 or 200 years in academia and Enlightenment thinking. That what we often perceive of as secular advancements against church doctrine and religious thinking is in fact a blossoming of the Christian spirit. So when we look at things like Enlightenment values and freedoms and equality and all of these kinds of things, and we think of them as, Enlightenment thinkers asserting these against religious influence, they're actually secretly wearing Christian clothing, hence the air we breathe, because you don't even notice that it's there. Because it's been so successful, in other words.
Yeah. How's that, Glenn?
I think there's an exceptional description of Tom Holland's view, I think. And so Tom Holland, one of those who's absolutely popularized this thesis in his 2019 book, Dominion. I think he and I would disagree on certain things. I think he would more own the word blossoming that you used, that Enlightenment values are a blossoming of a Christianity that was sort of inherent in that progression. I think I would make a slightly more modest claim on that point and just say that those developments were unthinkable without Christianity and have drawn on some profoundly Christian intuitions in the developments that they make. I think one of the issues that I have back and forth with Tom over is everything Christianity? Like literally everything? Is every blossoming, is every development, are we still in the same species? If we've evolved, to have six fingers instead of five, is it still Homo sapiens? If we've got to a Christianity that is now okay with infanticide and abortion, is this still Christian? I see Tom actually sort of drawing more of a circle, more of a line now than he did when he wrote Dominion. I think he might say blossoming. I think 2019 Tom Holland would say blossoming.
Yes.
I think I would say ripple effects that is unthinkable without.
Yeah, with Christianity as the stone that drops into the pond.
Yeah.
It does seem to me that Tom has become more sort of specifically Christianized in his thinking over the past few years. I'd imagine that if he were to rewrite Dominion today, it might be a little stronger on that point.
Well, in fact, he rewrote the beginning to Dominion, because I think even in the writing of Dominion, I think he came to some clearer convictions. And I honestly think that the opening to Dominion is just this beautiful proclamation of the cross. And as a historian, he is able to go back to sort of first century Rome and imagine himself into the sandals.
That wasn't originally there, the opening with the crucifixion.
So the opening of the crucifixion was the last thing that he wrote.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay, that was interesting. I didn't know.
And so, and he put it at the beginning of the book. And I think that is significant. I think in the audiobook, for instance, that is the bit that he voices. He voices the beginning and the end of Dominion. I think he's since re-recorded
Kind
the
of
audiobook.
summarizes the view, doesn't it? You sort of get to the end and you analyze it all, and then you realize that Christianity deserves to be right at the beginning there. I mean, that seems to be the view.
And that the cross, is the stone in the pond.
Yeah. Well, maybe one day it'll be Tom having the conversation with you, Alex. I'd love to host that at some point.
Oh, sure. He's welcome.
If you're watching, Tom, the invitation's there.
Or if you're not, the invitation is
absolutely
still there.
But in a sense, Glenn, you've sort of written this book, The Air We Breathe, which is, as you've called it, Tom Holland Light, or a sort of...
Dominion for dummies, and I'm the dummy. Yeah, I'm the dummy. Yeah.
But no, it's a really helpful, accessible way into, that bigger thesis that Tom Holland has obviously sketched out.
Well, it's confessionally Christian, whereas he did not write that book from that perspective at all. Yeah.
Well, let's do the same thing back, if that's okay. Where do you anticipate Alex goes when it comes to this question of how we received our moral intuitions?
I guess we'll see. But I think piecing together from things that I've heard Alex say about the Dominion thesis, I think it would be I think you think that I think that we think that Christianity is the air we breathe because of the Bible. And where I think your critique might come is it would be surprising if the Bible was the source of our current moral values, because I've read the Bible. And I recognize in the Bible things that are very bracing, to say the least, and not exactly like modern Western democratic values. Therefore, we can question whether Christianity and the Bible in particular is the source of those values. I'm not sure what you might think about how Christian abolitionism was, or how Christian the eradication of infanticide was, or how Christian the establishment of charities was. I don't think I've heard you speak about the historical side of things, but I think you're a Bible buff, and I think that might be where you go.
How's that, Alex?
It's certainly true that the Bible gives me pause, especially for Protestants who think that the Bible is sort of the foundational authority on what Christianity is all about. It's very difficult for me to square the paradox of a Christian text which has some quite explicit injunctions for and against things which are unthinkable today in the modern West, and somehow claiming ownership of those developments. But I think you're essentially either talking about two things when you say that the West is indebted to Christianity. You can either be talking about the Bible, or you can be talking about the history of the church. Those kind of are your two options, right? And you might want to say you're talking about like Jesus or the cross, but I consider that as sort of part of the scriptural tradition. You're talking about this story contained in the Gospels, right? And
So the scriptures have a tradition that culminates in Christ then.
How do you mean?
So you would say that you're either talking about the Bible or you're talking about Christian history. You are wanting to put Jesus and his cross as part of the scriptural tradition.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So it's scripture that has a tradition.
Yeah,
so scripture as a story culminating in Christ and him crucified.
Absolutely, for the Christians, of course, culminating in Christ, yes. And so I think that whichever of those you look at, you sort of run into trouble. Two things I should point out at the outset is, firstly, we can have this conversation remaining agnostic about whether Western values are correct. We don't need to say that freedom of speech and religion and the LGBT movement, abortion, any of that kind of stuff. We don't even need to see whether it's actually good or bad. The question at hand is whether Christianity has developed popular thinking on these issues. And the second thing to say is, interestingly, I think the most surface level critique people often make of this dominion thesis or air we breathe thesis is that there's nothing unique about Christianity, like this idea of the golden rule, or loving your enemy, or all of this kind of stuff crops up in other traditions. And the response to that is to say, okay, but the thesis here is quite limited. We're describing the development of Western values. So of course there might be, Confucian philosophy or Buddhist philosophy, but that's not relevant to the West. But when you say that these developments are unthinkable without Christianity, then I think it does become relevant that important parallels with the kind of ideas that we're talking about here, compassion, caring for the weak, and not allowing the strong to oppress the weak just by right of power, this kind of stuff, do crop up independently of Christianity. I think that raises a big red flag for the thesis that there's something uniquely Christian about that stone.
Why would we look for examples, for instance, of compassion and care for the weak and laud them? And we will find all sorts of examples of compassion and care for the weak in all sorts of cultures around the world. But I think this is part of the dominion thesis. I think this is part of the air we breathe. The very lenses we're using in order to go, I like the word compassion as I see it in Buddhism. I don't like the word dominance, or I don't like Spartan brutality, but I do like Confucianist desire to live in right relationship with your elders, right? Like, what are the lenses that we are looking through in order to cite other moral sources out there? And I would say those are being profoundly Christianized.
Yeah, so there's this question of are we looking upon these other traditions and judging them as good or bad? I'm interested in a slightly more neutral question of just their existence. The fact that they're there means that at the very least that kind of thinking can't be uniquely indebted to Christianity. I think it's also worth pointing out that the Greco-Roman period is a particularly brutal time in human history. But so you could say, Christianity enters into this Roman culture, which is extremely brutal, and it sort of civilizes it, if you will. Christians are rescuing the discarded infants from the dustbins of the streets and raising them in orphanages, I suppose, essentially. And this kind of stuff. I think it's true, of course, but I also think that the Jewish culture, as described in the Old Testament, Israelite conquests of Canaan, for example, is also an incredibly brutal kind of time, as we would recognize it today, and Christianity also enters into that. And so in the same way that the Christian wants to see this developmental trajectory, they say, okay, I know that our origin story in the Jewish exodus from Egypt and then the immediate enslavement, the immediate genocide of Canaanite tribe and this kind of stuff is really, really bad and brutal. It sort of flourishes towards Christianity. I think that if you ground Enlightenment values in particularly like a Greek tradition, which you could say that a few thousand years ago was extremely brutal, we can say that, well, yeah, but it flourished into something quite nice. So the brutality of the Roman world that Christianity entered into, I think, is mirrored by the brutality of the Jewish world into which Christianity entered on the Christian story, if you see what I'm saying.
But it was the Jews who, as well, within Roman society, were appalled by the brutality of Rome, by their practices of infanticide, by their practices of pederasty, which the Jews called paidophoria instead of pederasty, which means not child love, but child destruction. I think they found the Roman military valor to be really quite completely disjunctive of what the Jewish scriptures were saying all the time. I think when you're talking about that Old Testament war of Israel going up against Canaan, you're talking about a real David going up against Goliath, circling around a town and chanting after 7 days, and then the walls come down. They circumcise themselves before the battle. They are undermining themselves in every way. Now, there's all sorts of aspects of the book of Joshua that make us swallow hard. There are all sorts of aspects that put a lump in all our throats, but they wouldn't have put a lump in a Roman throat. They wouldn't have put a lump in Marcus Aurelius's throat. They wouldn't have put a lump in Muhammad's throat. They wouldn't have put a lump in Sun Tzu's throat. They do put a lump in both our throats.
They might have put a lump in Aristotle's throat.
But if the Canaanites could become natural slaves, then that is a just cause of war for Aristotle.
Yeah, but Aristotle has some depiction of a kind of just war theory in which, for a start, he thinks that the military should only be used defensively; it should not be used for conquest. And so I think that he would look
unless they are by nature slaves and can be ruled in that way.
Before we go too much further in this fascinating discussion, we've sort of, this has been really helpful for sketching out though what I initially asked, which was Glen to sort of say, can I summarize? Can I summarize? But what I'm hearing here is that you're satisfied that you got it right, Glen. I have a problem potentially with the Bible, especially the Old Testament, being the source of some of these moral values, as you say.
Also, I should say the New Testament as well.
Okay, right. Well, we can come to that. But then you're also wanted to add, and that's where we've been having this conversation, that it appears to you that these same aspects of morality can appear in other civilizations and cultures. They're not necessarily unique to Christian sort of culture. That you see them popping up, but that all cultures have had, if you like, their barbaric history.
Oh yeah,
which has, and so how are we to say it's not necessarily a flourishing from Greek culture that might equally lend us some of these?
But to be clear, I don't want to undermine the influence of Christianity. I mean, if the thesis is just that Western civilization has been greatly influenced by Christianity, it's like,
of course,
of course. But the idea, as you worded it earlier, Glen, in fact, you sort of put it more strongly than I tried to characterize your thesis, that these kind of developments would be unthinkable without Christianity. Perhaps we can dig into what those
certain
things are.
post-Christian developments are unthinkable without the road that they've gone through that is Christendom.
So maybe we could talk about what those are.
Well,
I mean, I don't know where you want to take this.
We want to get to some specifics, and so that's a good thing to do. I mean, I think we've heard, I'm sure it'll come through as well as we talk, Glen, that, as you elaborate the way that this has flowed out, as you see it, these modern values of kindness, equality, freedom, consent that we're going to be focusing on from those Christian origins and the way they've permeated the whole of our culture. Just one question before we leap into some specifics. It has become a very popular thesis, interestingly. It's not that Tom Holland was not the first person to point this out, but suddenly everyone seems to be talking about the Tom Holland thesis. And you have people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who you've both interviewed at different points, I think almost at an intellectual level, convinced about the value of Christianity because of suddenly starting to see that we can't sustain a culture like ours without the Christian story at the bottom of it. And I'd just be interested in just at the beginning, before we get to the specifics, your sense of where that's come from, why perhaps someone who was at one time the most famous female atheist in the world has had this kind of about turn that seems to be so linked to the need for Christianity as a foundational story for our culture and that kind of thing. Maybe start with you, Glen, and then come to Alex.
I think in one sense, the Tom Holland thesis is unremarkable and quite modest in that Christianization is 20 centuries of Christianization has had a profound impact on our moral sensibilities, and it's even had an impact on the way we see other sources of moral intuition in the West. I think that's actually quite a modest position to take on things, and quite widespread. Whether you're against Christianity and you're Nietzsche and you think, yes, Christianity has done a number on us all and it's a bad thing, or whether you are agnostic about these sorts of things like a Tom Holland is, or a Larry Seidentop, or a...
I suppose I'm asking, why is it resonating so much then? It's not new necessarily, and it's fairly modest in its claim, but it seems like everyone's picking it up suddenly, and I wonder, well, what's changed for it to become so resonant?
I think he wrote it in 2019, and I think if he'd written it 20 years earlier, that's when kind of the end of history was kind of being proclaimed as this, okay, we win, modern liberal Western democracies are the future, everybody will get on board, and it's plain sailing from here on in. And I think that there was the kind of the conceit that there's a post-war consensus, prosperity is on the up, stability is on the up, peace is reigning, and you could almost believe that everything's getting better in a kind of a Steven Pinker sort of sense, and I think in the last 20 years from there till 2019. We've gone through some incredible upheavals and a lot of people questioning just how obvious liberal Western democracy, democratic ideals are. I mean, one reason for that might be 9/11 and then the 9/11 wars, in which, okay, let's just remove the Taliban and Afghanistan will become an egalitarian utopia, or we'll just remove Saddam Hussein and modern Western liberal democracy will just reign. And I think we've had to wrestle in lots of different ways with those geopolitical issues. I think de-Christianization has happened in America in a quite profound way. 40 million Americans left church this century. And there's kind of a sense of, with institutional Christianity and believing Christianity in some senses in the West in the rearview mirror, I think there's been much more of a sense of people missing what they once had, and the Dominion thesis sort of naming that. I think at low tide you sort of see what the sea had done, in a sense that at high tide you have no idea about the shaping influence of the sea. Low tide actually might reveal that.
Low tide being a metaphor drawn from Matthew Arnold's Sea of Faith that has gone out, and only then do we see
the melancholy long withdrawing roar.
How that Sea of Faith shaped our
and of course, tides come back in again. That's
so it's been said.
That's the fun sort of rejoinder, isn't it?
But even if they don't, my point is, at low tide there are things that you see what lies beneath, and I think people have seen sort of anti-woke backlash as well. You know, there's a sort of progressivism that might be shorn of Christianity and become quite authoritarian, and people might be concerned about that. There's an anti-woke backlash that looks at that, and they call them the woke, and they actually want the power thing and the dominance thing. And so yeah, people have become they've seen that the story of the West has run out a little bit, and they're wondering, is there a grand narrative? And Tom Holland is giving them a historical narrative.
Do you broadly agree with the way Glen sees that?
I think so. I mean, with Ayan in particular, I think she's dealing with two things at once. She recounts a very personal depression that she had fallen into, and it's an old story that religion can help you sort of climb out of that, or I should say relationship with God. At the same time, she's deeply worried about politics, and I think that New Atheism fails to deliver on its promises, you know, this sort of humanist utopia where everybody's acting in accordance with reason and we all live in harmony, and all this just didn't emerge. And especially, I mean, politics in the past 10 years, I hate when people say, like, you know, especially given the current climate, as if there's ever been a time in history where you can't say such a thing. You know, there's always something going on. There's a world war, there's a pandemic. But I do think that the influence of mass immigration, which does seem genuinely novel, has caused a lot of people to suddenly be confronted by people who believe completely different things to them, and they're forced to sort of reassess what might have been the defining characteristics of their their belief system. And a lot of the time, you know, if the air is something that you don't really notice, I mean, you talk about it being the air you breathe and it being you don't even notice that it's there. If something comes along and essentially starts sort of changing the nature of the air, starts smelling of something a bit different, then you start to notice it, you know. And so I think that it's kind of just a cultural moment. And one thesis is that the thing that we lost is belief in Christianity. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but I think a lot of people are attracted to it as a plausible option.
Okay, well, that's helpful and really helps to frame, I think, the conversation we're going to have now about whether it's plausible, this idea that obviously Tom Holland, but you especially in The Air We Breathe, Glen, have given us, that ultimately many of the core values that most 21st century liberal Western people hold to and live their lives by fundamentally are irreducibly Christian at some level. The air we breathe obviously is your way of saying we almost don't notice this in our culture. We haven't up till now at least realised. But now perhaps you're pointing out that, as you say, some of these things need to be recognised and see that there is a source and so on. Why don't we start with compassion? Your book deals with about 7 different topics, but compassion, I think, is one of the easiest to get a grasp on because there are some very specific ways, examples you give of the way that the early Christians inculcated what you believe are the kinds of values around kindness and compassion that we now take for granted. But maybe sketch out that and then we'll see what Alex has to say.
Yeah, well, let me begin where Dominion begins, with the cross. And in my book, I talk about imagining myself into the shoes or into the sandals of a Roman centurion at the foot of the cross. And you really are dealing in a world of a very steep hierarchy of dominance, in which the slaves are absolutely at the bottom and the slave's death is the extreme penalty. And who should show up on that cross but the God of heaven? And it's the Jews in particular who are proclaiming that God has shown up on this cross. And of all the people to say the word God, you know, they're saying it with a weight that goes far beyond anything that the Romans were used to. And here is the great story that, according to Scripture, according to believers, you know, here is the highest figure descending to the deepest depths to have the greatest effect on the most number of people for the longest duration. Here is an unimprovable story of compassion, because I think, naturally speaking, it is survival of the fittest, and therefore the weakest are cast off. And here is the sacrifice of the fittest for we the weakest, so that we the weakest might survive and thrive and pass on a compassion revolution. And I think it really was a compassion revolution. Theresa Morgan often notes that a very common aphorism back in Roman times was, every day do something to help your friends and harm your enemies. And we all resonate with the first half of that, and the second half we go, yikes, you know. And we distance ourselves from that second half, but I think that second half makes perfect sense in a brutal world of scarcity. It makes perfect sense in an evolutionary frame, if you're just thinking about in-group amity and out-group enmity. It seems to perfectly describe nature in that sense. And that's why Nietzsche called this the transvaluation of all values, that you have the highest figure descending to the deepest depth in order to have compassion on us. And it birthed a compassion revolution in people who are taking that story very, very seriously. And things like charity, the way we think of charity today, hospitals, the way we think of hospitals today, orphan care that you've already mentioned, the way that we think of orphan care today, and then the abolition of things like the gladiatorial games, or the abolition of pederasty, the abolition of infanticide, and absolutely on the statute books, the first people ever to outlaw this practice it's close to a human universal. You know, Tacitus, you know, speaks of some German tribes that don't kill their offspring, and that was remarkable to him. But exposing infants, largely girls, the disabled, was just a very common practice. And now I
Just explain what exposing means for those who perhaps aren't familiar with the terminology.
Right, leaving them in a rubbish dump to die of exposure or be taken by dogs, or putting them down a well, or drowning them in rivers, killing them. And I think there's an example of a moral intuition that has gone from, certainly it might be grubby, it might be unfortunate, it can be explicable and excused, though, in a sort of a Roman frame as in a time of scarcity, this is, needs must. But I don't think any of those kind of I don't think any of those justifications fly with us nowadays, and I don't think Rome itself was going to bring any of those reforms about under its own steam, given its own kind of moral and spiritual resources. I think it's definitely Christianity that has brought those about. And there is an example, I think, of some compassionate moral intuitions that ground themselves in some moral progress. And it is certainly Christians who are at the forefront of that.
Okay. Thoughts, Alex?
Well, there's a lot to say, right? I mean, like I say, I don't want to the sin I think both sides, as it were, commit on this issue is, I think, an overemphasis, is to say that in the same way that you might say exposure in the ancient world, it does seem to be that we have records of Christians being the ones who are sort of anti this, who are sort of the antidote to exposure. And of course, yeah, happy to grant that. I just don't want to overstep the influence of Christianity in particular over the entire development of the Western tradition. In the same way, I might want to talk about the way that the church has stood in the way of a number of important instances of progress towards the West today. And I don't mean moral progress in an objective sense. I just mean movement from where it was to where it is. But you then wouldn't want me to overstep and say, therefore, the church has been, the greatest roadblock, and Christianity is evil and terrible. So I just don't want to overstate the case. My biggest problem with Christianity as responsible for these developments is its attachment to Judaism, to the extent that in the early church, Marcion famously thought that the God of the Old Testament could not be the same God of Jesus. He produces this text called the Antithesis, where he compares the sayings and doings of the Old Testament God and Jesus, and says these cannot be the same kind of person. And as long as you've got this attachment to this Jewish tradition, I find it very difficult to square how you have these kinds of condemnations that Christianity, allows people to have of Roman practices, without them similarly indicting the God that I'm told is the God that sort of came down into the figure of Jesus. They sort of have this excusability with the Jewish God. Now, you might say that the very means by which they're able to look at the Jewish God and say these are things which trouble me and things I don't like, is essentially Christian. But if that's the case, then you're kind of left with a paradox as to what you're talking about when it comes to Christian values. If you want to agree with what I'm saying, which is that those are still present in the Old Testament, then you kind of become a bit of a Marcionite in saying that, well, the only thing that matters is Jesus. We can just kind of ignore the Old Testament, say that was wrong and that doesn't matter. Or if you need to own it and not be a Marcionite, not be a heretic, then you need to offer an account for how that wasn't wrong when Yahweh was doing it. And how, it's okay for Jesus to enter into that world and not be seen as this sort of, fundamental negation of the Jewish religion. Whereas when he does it for the Romans, it's a negation as well. Also, it's quite easy to pick on specific examples. For example, why do the Romans invade Gaul? We have Julius Caesar's own words as to why he invaded Gaul. What are some of the reasons? Do we know? Well, one reason he gives is that the people there essentially are practicing human sacrifice. He includes this as one of the things that these people do, which, it sort of carries some of the justification for invading. Now, of course, in his heart of hearts, Julius Caesar probably just wanted Gaul for himself, but he at least appealed to this notion. Now, I could easily say, look, there is this, popular Judeo-Christian tradition, which has this sort of, which is totally okay with human sacrifice. The famous story of Abraham and Isaac, of course, Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac in the end, but it's the willingness to commit, and indeed, the sacrifice of his own child in reverence to this sort of strange ancient philosophical belief that they had, which we would never recognize today, that you should sacrifice your own children on behalf of your philosophical convictions. Also in Exodus chapter 22, verse 29, there's this very strange injunction to sacrifice your children to God, which is like immediately renegotiated, where God says, as with the lamb. Please pull it up. And there's a lot of debate about exactly what that means. Some people think that this actually would be an instance of you will, I forget the term, but you sacrifice someone else in their place, but on the 8th day, you give your firstborn to the Lord, as you do with animals as well. While you're looking at that, I'll give you another example, because that one's a bit more controversial, but I could easily point to it, especially as an ancient reader looking back and saying, like, look at what was present there. Of course, Christianity itself is predicated on a human sacrifice, which is the sacrifice of Jesus. Now, I could say, look at this strange intuition that nobody thought, nobody seems to sort of have a qualm with this kind of thing. Of course, in some Old Testament passages, Israel does end up having a qualm with human sacrifice. I think that's a renegotiation of the principle. But I could say, but look, then you have this Roman tradition, which looks at the human sacrifice of the Gauls and says, no, that's terrible, we're going to invade and we're going to civilize them. And say, see, so the sort of respect for the sanctity of humans and the abolition of human sacrifice, we're really indebted to the Romans for that. I think that would just be a bit too simple. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it absolutely would. And this is why...
Did you find the verse?
Yeah. Are you talking about Exodus 22:29?
Maybe I've got the verse wrong. What does that say?
Exodus 22:29. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses.
That can't be it. What's
The
next?
firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days shall be with his mother. On the 8th day...
On the 8th day,
On the 8th day you shall give it to me.
the firstborn, in the same way that you do with the oxen and the sheep. So
But they were ransomed, and I don't know what the price was, but that was the cost of that life was given towards the temple as money.
well, that's what they say. But in that particular instance, it's
Even within Exodus, that's true.
Elsewhere in Exodus.
Elsewhere, okay.
Let's not get caught up on that verse. There's some.
Well, no, but
this
is my issue with. I think you're going to the Bible in a way that's alien to the way that anybody has ever gone to the Bible. Like to go into a verse and take out of it as a timeless principle that stands by itself and probably could cause somebody to kill their son. It's just not the way. I mean, Christians, that they don't read their Bibles that way. You must know Christian history. You know that that's not the way that Christendom has read the Bible in that way. So what are you right about reading the Bible that way? And the rest of
what I'm doing is I'm showing it's a bit too simple to do this, right? Like I'm trying to demonstrate, because obviously the sort of approach that I'm taking here, you will see as illegitimate, and I think is illegitimate to some degree. I think it's got some
even within Exodus, but yes.
Yes, but then Exodus is a series of sort of renegotiations over scriptural history. I mean, I'm not the first person to think that particular verse is an instance of command for human sacrifice that survives into the biblical tradition that is then renegotiated. Scholars, debated, of course, but what I'm saying is I could do that, but I think it would be too lazy. What we need to do is look at the overall picture that we get from these stories. What is the picture that we get from reading the Old Testament and this God? And what is the picture that we get of Jesus and his relationship to that God?
That might be a helpful place
and where
to
does
go
that give us these ideas of compassion and equality?
So I mean, the big picture thing, without getting into the weeds of the Exodus thing, and that I understand.
And you're going to go to the first page of the Bible, which I think might actually be the second page of the Bible.
Okay. I'm actually going to go to Genesis 22.
Oh,
I was going to go to Abraham and Isaac. A wonderful proclamation.
All right, let's go there, and then we'll look at the bigger picture.
I mean, so the whole issue is Abraham is promised a seed. He and Sarah are totally childless. And after barrenness, miraculously, they finally have a son. He is the seed of Abraham, which is utterly messianic terms. He is the heir of the cosmos, the hope of the world. Here is this child. And then God goes and tested Abraham and says, Abraham, and he said to him, here I am, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah. Mount Moriah is where the temple is, so a mountain in the region of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, even within Genesis, you're thinking, but he's the hope of the world. He's the heir of the cosmos. He's the seed of Abraham. And he's being told to be sacrificed, and somehow through that sacrifice, what? Because the whole world is going to be blessed through this famous golden child. And he's to be sacrificed as a burnt offering, which is a sacrifice of atonement, on a mountain in the region of Jerusalem. As the story progresses, the son has the wood on his back, the father has the fire and the knife, the tools of judgment, and he's trudging up a mountain in the region of Jerusalem on his way to become a sacrifice of atonement, this one who is the seed of Abraham, who is the heir of the cosmos. Abraham says, we will worship there and then we will come back to you, which the New Testament picks up as he seems to have some kind of trust that through sacrifice and out the other side, somehow, the chosen one will come back to us. And obviously, in that moment, the angel of the Lord intercepts judgment and says, now I know that you fear me because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And he provides the ram in the thicket as a substitute for Isaac, the promised child. And so on that occasion, the ram is sacrificed, but Abraham had said a lamb will be provided. And so the whole thing ends with verse 14. Where is verse 14? So Abraham called the name of that place, this mountain in the region of Moriah, the Lord will provide. And it is said to this day, on the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. What shall be provided? The lamb, the true son, the seed of Abraham, the heir of the cosmos.
Yeah, Jesus.
And they knew which mountain it was going to be on. And so this is a Christian way of reading the text, but I think it's a Christian way of reading the text that it is utterly consonant with the Hebrew details. But the way that Christians read Old Testament texts is not that, oh, here's an injunction. Abraham was told to do this very strange thing that, as you say, the Lord says, it never entered my mind to think about human sacrifice in the past. And yet, narratively, we are being told something about Christ and him crucified. And this is the way that Christians read Scripture, right?
Yeah,
not as Abraham was told that, so I guess I can kill my son.
Of course, yeah.
But and we take the details seriously and we take them through the cross.
Many scholars see this as kind of a mythological retelling of the story by which human sacrifice came to an end. The practice of human sacrifice got replaced by animal sacrifice because at some point in our anthropological history this occurs, and many people see this as
not in the Bible, but
they see this as an encoding of this in the biblical story. That this is what it's described.
They're welcome, but within the world of the Bible, that's not the world that the Bible describes.
I agree. I think it depends how you're reading it, right? If you're reading it as a Christian, of course, that's how you're going to read it. What I'm saying is it's too simplistic an approach. I'm demonstrating the simplicity in my very own approach there.
Mm-hmm.
I so where we've got to is that you're just aware here, Alex, that there's a number of different factors that might go into the emergence of the values we have around kindness and compassion in today's world, and you're not in any way dismissing the fact that Christianity was an important motivator in various aspects, but you're questioning this whole idea that it's too simple to say it just came out of the Bible. The Bible is a very complex.
Not just that, but also that, like, we talk about compassion, and compassion is such an ambiguous term that, by the way, obviously does crop up in other traditions, to the extent that if you're just talking about compassion, you can't be talking about something which is uniquely indebted to Christianity. The thesis is more specific than that. It says that our modern sort of conception of Western values comes from Christianity. So I don't just want to know where compassion... In fact, if I were just to grant that, okay, this idea of compassion, maybe even, the idea that all human beings have the imago Dei and they've all got worth for that reason, and that's what gives us this, antithesis to exposure and that kind of stuff. We're talking about Western values, right? And when you say Western values to somebody, and you say, well, what are the principal values of the West? If you were to ask a scholar or you to ask someone on the street, what defines Western values, you think? Do you think that they would say compassion, consent? Maybe they'd say equality, but I think they'd say things like this. And I wonder if in listing some of these things, you can think, or perhaps provide, and people listening at home can think of what might be a biblical or church tradition grounding for any of these things. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom for free sexual encounter between any two consenting adults. Free market capitalism is really important to the development of the West. The military and colonialism, nationalism. These are the kinds of things which I think actually define the West of the past few hundred years. And I don't think any of them have a grounding, let alone a unique grounding in Christian principles.
Oh, goodness. I mean, certainly the first five things you mentioned are unthinkable without having come through centuries and centuries of Christianization. Was freedom of speech the first thing you sort of mentioned? I mean, that was absolutely hammered out in Protestant Catholic disputes. John Milton coming very strongly for freedom of speech, and then from dissenters from the Church of England wanting to have the freedom to be able to express their own views, and eventually sailing across to America and there you see some profoundly Christian history behind, why does America have a First Amendment that, the United Kingdom does not? It's the sort of question that you cannot answer without consulting Christian history and Christians doing things that they certainly interpreted them as acting for Christian purposes. Yeah.
I mean, I was going to move us on to equality, which I feel is kind of part and parcel.
Okay,
of this
I think it's
but
worth pointing out. I guess briefly, I would consider that in the same way that you might use something like the abolitionist movement, which you would see as which we'll get onto shortly, I'm sure. But emerging in a Christian culture, fine. But there are two theses here. It's either that you've got this Christian worldview which exists as the biblical stories from which it grew, and then the early Catholic Church, and then you've got the Protestants coming along, and you've either got this story of a flourishing of Christian values into freedom of speech, or you've got this story of a kind of disintegration from this original idea that you certainly don't get ideas of freedom of thought and freedom of religion and freedom of speech from the Bible. You can be put to death for believing, for worshipping the wrong thing, right? We definitely cannot ground in the Bible the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of religion.
In theology, the difference between speech and violence, on a naturalistic worldview, is there a great difference between speech and violence? Whereas on a theological view, the idea that Jesus says, "Put away your sword, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword," and then the only sword he gives to the church is the sword of the Spirit, a spiritual sword. What is that? It's the Word of God.
Yes.
And then the idea of missionary encounter all throughout medieval Europe was to go armed with persuasion.
Yes, you write about that in the book as well, right?
I think that is part of the intellectual genealogy.
What I'm trying to explain here is that I see two stories here, right? If freedom of religion, as we consider it today, is essentially a Christian idea, which I find extremely strange, reading the Bible in particular, then it would make sense that it develops over the history of the church. But if freedom of religion is actually a principle which is asserted against the Christian tradition, we would also expect it to come as at the somewhere in the story of going from a fledgling Jesus movement into an early church, into a Protestant Reformation, and then as people begin to wane on the authority of Christianity, they then start establishing these principles for themselves. And I think you've described exactly how these things did come about. People began to realize that their own interests weren't being served by the church in the case of the Protestants, and they decided we want to be able to assert our own views here. Same thing happens in America, where there's disputes between churches and state, and Jefferson famously writing about the disputes that they have, and these are put in place, these protections, as much to protect the church as to protect the people who are trying to not attend that church. But I think what we're seeing here is a disintegration and an assertion of your own self-interest, essentially.
I mean, if I were to try to summarize this, Ali, is it that you're concerned that Glen is passing off as quote-unquote Christian, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, not because it's tied inherently to the biblical witness, but because the circumstances that happened historically around the church led to people developing these ideas, not necessarily because they somehow find their seed in...
Especially, I know that Glen has a lot to say about the concept of rights, and it's true that you get talk of rights and conceptions of rights dating back to the 11th, 12th centuries, maybe even prior to that. But clearly the kind of rights as are embedded into the Western framework today start to emerge.
Let's talk
in
about
the 17th and 18th century.
This is where I wanted to go.
And I think that those rights are an assertion of self-interest.
Okay.
They're not a flourishing of religious tradition. I think that they are essentially a result of conflict that people are trying to protect against.
We will come back to that. We'll put a pin in that and come back to it, because I think this neatly moves us into the next area I was hoping to kind of get into, which is equality, another key value that Glen, you say, has its foundations in the Christian story. Obviously, your view is, and perhaps you can elucidate some of this now, that obviously that was worked through by theologians and the church and into what we might call a modern declaration of human rights or whatever it might be, but that somehow that was unthinkable, as you say, without the Christian story that ultimately gave rise to it. Alex, I think we're going to hear why he feels that's a stretch too far. But make the case first for equality as a fundamentally Christian idea.
Yuval Noah Harari makes the argument that equality is a fundamentally biblical idea generated from a belief in God and souls. But he then goes on to say, but if we no longer believe in God and souls, then what do we do with this idea of equality? So I think that the thesis that Christianity has shaped our moral intuitions is made from lots of different directions. There are people who think Christianity has shaped our Western values, and it's not a good thing. I think Tom Holland, for instance, is the sort of person who thinks, oh gosh, I do believe in the human rights thing, and I now see the dependence upon the Christian thing, and if I might as well be hung for a sheep as for a lamb, and so I'm going to dive into the Christian thing. Now, that leaves me with the job of, is there a link between Christian faith and equality? Declaration of Independence. So in June of 1776, Thomas Jefferson writes the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be
sacred,
except
and undeniable.
Yeah, sacred and undeniable. Exactly, sacred and undeniable. So he sent that.
That's the first draft.
That's the first draft. He sent that out. Benjamin Franklin put 6 lines through sacred and undeniable, and just says self-evident. And I think that's a perfect description for the ways in which we have moved from an explicitly Christian understanding of something like equality or rights, and moved towards a purported rational basis for these things, which I think has smuggled in what are properly Christian ideas under a kind of an Enlightenment, secular humanist.
I mean, the self-evident decision by Franklin to put self-evident instead of sacred is essentially that move to the air we breathe. It's, oh, of course it's self-evident, because this is the air we breathe. Why would we ever have to imagine that this has a supernatural basis? But you're saying it did have a supernatural basis.
Well, I mean, he didn't edit out that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Thomas Jefferson...
the Creator wasn't in Jefferson's original draft.
Is that right?
That's right. He does say created, but he doesn't say creator, which is kind of
Creator. So who added Creator? So
it was Congress or something. I can't remember who it was who did that.
There was a secularizing and a more religifying...
remember that bit of Hamilton, but I don't. Anyway.
But, okay, so, I mean, Jefferson is getting this language from John Locke, who is arguing right back from Genesis chapter 1 and from the image of God, Genesis 1 and 2, from the image of God. The Enlightenment thinkers were originally much more explicitly Christian than they ended up being. And you see in that process from John Locke, who is just explicitly biblical in his framing of human rights coming from a biblical understanding of the image of God, from Locke to Jefferson to Franklin to today, when we all just kind of assume that these things are self-evident. And yet I would say the one thing that's self-evident about rights is that they're not self-evident. And if they were, they would be much more widespread in human civilizations around the world. This is why Tom Holland in his book says, the ultimate seedbed of the American Revolution was, no matter what some of its framers might have thought, the book of Genesis. An Old Testament book, right? A book that I think we're very glad exists, and that has been at the heart of the rights revolution.
When you talk about the book of Genesis, are you really just talking about chapter 1, verse 27? Or is there anything else in Genesis that you think is relevant here?
Well, the entire creation narrative is a radically different narrative to either the religious ancient Near Eastern conception of the day.
Specifically, what is it that uniquely contributes towards this, flourishing in the Enlightenment from Genesis?
That we are made, A, in God's image, and B, to have dominion. And so both those things are important in terms of our inherent worth and dignity, and in terms of the fact that God did not make us to be slaves, but made us to rule, which was very important in abolitionism, which we might get to.
There's a lot to say. You track this back to John Locke, for example. What were we just talking about? What did Locke think about atheists? He thought that they couldn't be trusted. He thought that you couldn't make legally sort of binding agreements with them. He thought so much for freedom of religion, right? that's certainly...
Is that a bad thing, or you're stating that as it?
I'm saying that like we were discussing a moment ago, this concept of freedom of religion as a flourishing of these ideas, and that obviously didn't apply to John Locke. Of course, by the time you get to the American Revolution, you have men in a room writing these declarations and these constitutions who at least themselves did not see themselves as engaged in a Christian project. Jefferson is famously not a Christian. He's famously anti-Christian.
Yeah, him and Franklin were the two least Christian men.
Gouverneur Morris is the same. The man who wrote the words. He also put a pen, but this time to the Constitution, which is the actually legally binding one, which originally opened, we the people of New Hampshire, New York, and so on. And he put a line through it and said, "We the people of the United States of America." And he was once asked what he thought the hand of God was in forming this miraculous Constitution, and he said it was the work of plain, honest men. He didn't recognize such a thing. Perhaps the most important founding father might have been Thomas Paine, because Thomas Paine is the one who got this whole thing going in the first place. A lot of people didn't really want revolution. They just wanted proper representation in Parliament if they were going to be American subjects of a British rule. But Thomas Paine is the one who convinced everybody that actually we need revolution, we need to assert our rights. And we know that Thomas Paine was not a friend of Christianity. He writes thoroughly against Christianity to the extent that he had to live in exile. And then when he finally died, his bones were lost, and no one wanted to come to his funeral. He was
once asked what his philosophy was. It was to act justly, love mercy, and work for human flourishing. Right, and you'll recognize that act justly, love mercy is Micah chapter 6. And then he adds the sort of the humanistic gloss to it. I think that's another perfect example of some profoundly Christian ideas that have just been...
But these men at least saw themselves as working contra Christianity.
Yeah, they might have seen themselves as that.
And you could say that maybe you have a better sort of grasp of their psychological motivations than they do, but I think...
When they say rights, they are showing us the intellectual genealogy, and it runs right through the heart of Christendom.
Yeah, because I want to talk about rights, but... That's kind of I suppose that's a separate subject, because we're talking about equality here, right? And when I hear the word equality, I'm thinking equality between whom? Like, in what context do equality come up? They come up in things like racial discrimination.
Yeah.
They come up in things like gender discrimination. And there is...
Jefferson held 600 slaves as he wrote that.
And there is absolutely no way that you can look at the Bible or the history of the church and think that there is... I think even in embryo, the idea of something like our modern conception of gender equality that's indebted to a feminist movement. So people of Tom Holland's ilk like to say that the feminist movement is essentially Christian in origin, and I think that the justifications for such a view is essentially roundabout. So why don't we focus in? Most people today, when you ask them, do you think that men and women are equal? They don't just say they both have equal worth in the sense that neither should be killed. They don't just say that they have equal worth and that, if you have a child, you shouldn't, abort one just because it's a woman. They say that there's a sort of equal societal standing of men and women. And I'm wondering if you can identify where in the Christian tradition that comes from.
What they want to also say is difference, right? And the culture wars that are tearing us apart are, how do we affirm both the difference of male and female and their ontological equality?
It depends what you consider to be like the Western position on the equality of women.
And it depends what you consider to be the feminist movement, because there's not just one feminist movement. Like, are we on wave 5? Or like, which wave are we on? And it just goes to show that actually difference and equality is really difficult. And it's not as though the year 2025 is the utopian, we're at the Platonic ideal of how to relates equality and difference, and in fact things are going back and forwards with Supreme Court rulings.
But you understand what I'm driving at, right? Like famously, Paul, who is the most important early Christian writer to the extent that his letters, and some letters that were probably not written by him but claimed to be written by him as well, found their way into the scriptural canon and explicitly tell us things like women should remain silent in churches. If they've got a question, they should go home and ask their husbands, for it's a disgrace for a woman to speak in church.
Which within the same book, so that's 1 Corinthians 14, isn't it?
That's right.
And then earlier in chapter 11...
talking about prophesying.
Women praying and prophesying. So either Paul is contradicting himself within 3 chapters, or, perhaps the word gune, which means wife and woman, is that's what he's saying.
What's he saying?
That there was a problem within Corinth. Worship services were an utter zoo. You have people speaking in tongues. You have people getting drunk at communion. And were there wives speaking over their husbands as they were preaching, right? And he's like, we'll sort that out at home, okay? I think that is the sort of interpretation of 1 Corinthians 14 that actually makes sense of 1 Corinthians 11.
I disagree with that, of course, I disagree with that. I think the interpretation that makes sense is that Paul didn't write that verse and it found its way into the scriptural canon as a mistake because somebody had read 1 Timothy 2:11 onwards and was making a note in the margin and it found its way into the text. It's the only part of Paul's letters which move around in early manuscripts. It's really interesting. There's a lot of really good scholarship on why that wasn't actually written by Paul. Interestingly, I, as a skeptic of the biblical tradition, am able to absolve Paul and say Paul was not a sexist because he didn't write those words, whereas the Christian has to own them. It's in there. It's part of the scriptural canon, right? It doesn't just say, and by the way, you could say, right, this was, like Timothy was written to like a church in Ephesus and you had like the cult of Artemis and yeah, there were women who were taking authority that wasn't rightfully, like maybe, but we don't have that. We've inherited a scriptural tradition which has quite clearly been interpreted throughout history as saying that women, for a start, certainly can't hold church office. Now, the Protestants changed their mind about that, but I don't know how they square that with what's in the scripture. What I'm saying is that, like, you don't think that the inequality between men and women might have been somehow bolstered by these kinds of biblical injunctions. I mean, Paul also
says
don't
think that the reason why we are so interested in gender equality in the West has anything to do with Christianity?
It depends what you mean by anything to do with Christianity.
Well, okay, so we've got this scriptural...
Because I think that when you look at the history of rights, you're not looking at a blossoming of Christian tradition. I think what you're looking at is people beginning to assert their own self-interest. I mean, the case in point for this, right? Like, if you want to look for a sort of archetypal origin of rights talk in the UK, it's going to be Magna Carta, right? If you look at the Magna Carta, what happened? Like there's this incompetent king who the barons are all really upset with and he's charging them too much money. And so what do? They show up with their swords and they say, you have to stop doing this and you have to agree to abide by the certain kind of rules that we're all going to agree to and you're going to be below the law. And the king with, 500 swords in his face goes, okay, fine. And that's where you get the birth of rights. It's not a bunch of people sat around having, meditating and praying and going, you know what, I think that God would want us to have these rights. And the same thing happens.
If the gender equality concerns of 2025 are important to you, in which culture or civilization would you rather live? One that has a Christian tradition behind it or one that has not?
Well, it depends. I mean, what other kind of traditions are you talking about?
Well, there's Islam around the world.
Well, I wouldn't like to live there.
There's a very venerable tradition.
I think I wouldn't mind living in a Buddhist tradition, for example.
In terms of gender equality, in terms of rights speak, in terms of...
Well, it's not the same kind of rights speak in the
it's
same
not,
way,
exactly,
right?
and that's really the thesis.
But do you think, for example, that the feminist movement, women having the right to vote, representation in power, even, being allowed to run for office as well in the first place, do you think that would have happened, would have gotten off the ground, if women themselves hadn't just tried to assert it for themselves? Do you think, in other words, if they'd have done what the Bible tells them to do, and to essentially stay silent and ask their husbands at home, instead of coming out and saying, we've got something that we want, and we're going to throw ourselves under horses until we get it.
Female suffrage.
Do you think that men, on their own, that like Christian men of the Enlightenment era would have just sat around and gone, you know what? It's been hundreds and hundreds of years that we've been Christian, and I think, and there's all these verses that but I think we've been getting it wrong, and I think we should give women the right to vote. Do you think they would have just done that on their own because of the influence of Christianity?
Listen, just read through the
without the protests of women.
Read through the book of Acts, and you will see Philip's got his 4 daughters who are all evangelists. You have Priscilla and Aquila. She is named first in this house church. She is correcting Barnabas when he's going off on one. He gets to the end of the book of Romans, and Romans chapter 16 is just talking about all his co-workers, and there's women everywhere. There's Junia, who is outstanding among the apostles. There's Phoebe, the deacon. This is extraordinary. And so taking that trajectory and moving it forwards, I think the most obvious explanation for why universal suffrage has had a Western intellectual genealogy is surely Christianity.
But, do you think those were the conversations that men of their own accord were having Like, absent the protests of women who were getting fed up with their material conditions, you think that men were just sitting around having these conversations going, Junia and Phoebe were really important, and, Paul seems to say that she's an apostle, and so maybe we should give women the right to it. Like, you think that would have just happened without the assertion of people? Like, I think that
but I think that's fine. The assertion of, female agitation for female suffrage is wonderful.
But I'm saying without that, you think that it would have happened? You think that it would have been successful? I think if you look at the history of rights...
But you seem to be assuming that the only kind of person who would agitate for female suffrage would themselves not be driven by Christian convictions. What's your evidence for that?
What do you mean?
Well, you seem to think that I would have a problem with suffrage coming because there were women agitating for the vote. I don't have a problem with that, and I don't see how
they were doing so because they were sort of going to church and learning that they should emancipate themselves from the pulpit.
Well,
rather than just being a bit fed up with the material conditions that they found themselves in.
Oh, I think it's both.
I mean, so for example, the only time...
all women
let Glen just respond here.
All women everywhere might be fed up with patriarchal societies. Who has overturned patriarchy more than Western societies? And is it... It seems to me that the default position is, when we look back at our Christianized history, when we look at other cultures and notice that they have not had those same developments, you might imagine that there is some alternative history that could have got us to where we got to. But that seems to me an implausible story, and that seems to me an untestable story. The story...
Yes. I mean, so I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just saying yes, because one of the big problems of this is testability. But I want to talk about that, but I really just want to sort of... There are all kinds of reasons why this could have only happened in the West. It might have had some... I mean, I think that a lot of the development of people's individual rights, their ability to begin asserting them, had a lot to do with technology. Feminism in particular. Really importantly, some of the roles that society could not do without.
The washing machine.
Exactly.
Transformed feminism.
So much, right? And so it's easy to say that it's because, they were going to church. I mean, if that were the case, why didn't they do it 500 years ago? Why then? That happened to coincide with technological developments which allowed them to get out on the street and protest, right? Now, we might then need to talk about the scientific revolution as to why washing machines were invented in the first place, and we're going to disagree on that. But I really want to, just drill down here and think, I think that people who are living in oppressive conditions will have a motivation to, when they have an opportunity, try to overcome that, regardless of whether or not they're Christians. The only time in history that there's been a successful slave revolt on the level of a society, whereby, slavery has been overthrown and a new government and colonialism thrown off and slavery abolished of their own accord because of their own revolt, is the Haitian Revolution. It's in Haiti, right?
Yeah.
I do not think that Haitians were living in slavery under colonial rule and they were kind of okay with it. And then they started thinking about Christianity and read the Bible and decided, you know what, now it's time to rise up. I think that there was enough in the disutility and the preference against the conditions they were living in, that when they saw an opportunity, they seized it and did so successfully. And I think that that is the history of rights. I think that Magna Carta is a result of barons holding swords to the king. I think that feminism is a result of women saying, we don't want to do this anymore. I think that slavery is as a result in the Haitian Revolution of the slave.
In the
result.
Haitian Revolution.
But in other cases,
yes.
It's the development of photography. Think of the importance, and not solely, but think of the importance of Paul Peter, the lashed back, the image that shocks everybody, right? It's not as simple as just saying that some people started thinking about Christianity and going to church, and that's what motivated them. Because if that's the case, why did it take so long? And why did it coincidentally come along with the Enlightenment? You know what I mean?
Okay. Should we go to slavery and abolition? Is that, or is there something you want to say before?
Let me just. I won't add to that. I'll clarify. I think one thing my book, The Air We Breathe, doesn't really do is the sort of technology shock stuff. It doesn't talk about material conditions, which is a lack. And you might get the idea that these 7 values kind of float down as Platonic ideals and just embed themselves in Western values. It was a lot messier. And your description of Magna Carta is a good example of 5 steps forwards, 4 steps back, bloody, mixed motives, technology is playing a part, enrichment is playing a part. So I totally take that. Nevertheless, all those sorts of vicissitudes of historical conditions are happening everywhere in the world. And it seems to be...
Yeah, but you asked me that question, isn't it? Why within Christendom did this happen? Where, around the time of the Enlightenment, 16, 17, 1800s, where were the most, where was the most technological development happening?
Well, China, right?
Oh, okay, all right.
Look, but seriously, China, I mean, the ships, in China...
The ships aren't really doing much for the material conditions of...
Well, they could do if they used them, unfortunately, like the New World explorers did for resource extraction and that kind of thing.
If anything, that the development of better ships would make the slaves have a better time under the boats, right? I'm talking about the kinds of material condition, the changes in material conditions that were relevant to the assertion of rights. I don't actually know where the washing machine was invented, but I would guess it was probably in the West. I don't know that for sure, but I just think it is extraordinary to think that there is this history, thousands of years long, of textual evidence of the differential treatment of women, and a church history of the differential treatment of women, and a society which has historically been quite brutal to women over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds
compared to
and
what?
Hundreds and hundreds
compared
of years.
To what?
Compared to what we think today.
Okay, but
now, when that finally happens, Christians want to turn around and say, oh, that's because of Christianity. That's because over those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, nobody realized that this was what was really being gotten at all along. And this just so happens to coincide with the technological revolution and Enlightenment thought.
Enlightenment thought, rights predates Enlightenment thought. These
not
beliefs,
really. Not really. Where do you think rights come from? Where's an early source of rights?
Let's allow Glen a chance to sketch out a bit of historical detail for why you see Christianity informing those Enlightenment values.
I think that 11th, 12th century canon lawyers doing the flip side of our obligation. So I have an obligation to a poor person, and that is for the person in power in order to serve the person who is powerless. In the 11th, 12th centuries, you start to get the idea of the poor person has a right to sustenance. They are entitled, right? And that starts to be a discourse that is developed through the medieval period, to the point where somebody like a John Locke, coming along sort of post-Reformation, is speaking in these absolute terms about the rights of man that are grounded in natural law. They are getting all this language from medieval theologians, like 100%. Now, what we have nowadays, and something that is not a universally positive development, is that rights are now considered separate from obligations. There's all sorts of discourse around rights as a sword as opposed to rights as a shield. The protection of the weak seems to be the origin of this idea of the inviolable worth of this person. So this person's rights cannot be traded off against the communal greater good. And so rights as a shield was very much at the heart of things. I think this is another example of ways in which Christian intuitions have been taken in post-Christian directions, in ways that are unthinkable without Christianity, but are not what Christians are saying.
Why do you describe those as Christian intuitions? You're talking about the strong not oppressing the weak?
That there is an inviolable and inherent dignity to each person, such that their rights cannot be traded away. Yeah, that's a Christian thing.
I mean, I feel like if you broaden rights to be essentially rules for the sort of protection of how people engage with each other that are based on a prohibition on the strong being able to oppress the weak. You've got the prologue of Hammurabi's code. Quite explicitly, that's what it says. It says that this is such that the strong shall not be able to oppress the weak, and then you've got a load of rules about how people are to engage with each other.
Yeah, and then you've got laws that are different depending on what part of the social strata you're a member of.
It's true, but also in the same way, when you want to talk about rights talk beginning to exist, like in your book, you talk about the Gregorian reforms, which I think you place too much stock in these reforms as being like an origin of rights talk. But even if they are, you're not talking about rights universally. You say, well, it's enough to say that we're beginning to get these inklings of the kind of thing we're talking about. Well, that's what I'm just doing with Hammurabi's code. And you're saying, yeah, but then if you look at the details, I'm saying, well, look at the details of the Gregorian reforms. It was mostly about, like enforcing celibacy amongst the priesthood and saying that secular authorities aren't allowed to, institute clergy members. That has to go straight to the Pope. In fact, it was sort of a reassertion of papal power, which is, I think, quite against the democratic principles which people consider in the West in terms of structural governmental organization. So, I think, in other words, this whole thing, I think, is an overemphasis on Christianity and an underemphasis on other potential influences. So when it comes to something like Hammurabi's Code, or when it comes to, I don't know, the Hippocratic Oath, which even today people refer to as the sort of foundation of medical ethics, years before Christianity, thousands of years before Christianity, you have the Hippocratic Oath, or rather, thousands of years before the developments that we're talking about, I should say.
Right.
You have the Hippocratic Oath, and what does it say? It says that whoever's house I walk into, rich or poor, male or female, I am to serve them. Now, I have absolutely no doubt. Now, I'm not going to say that means our modern Western ethical medical tradition is indebted to Hippocrates, who probably didn't even write that. But I have absolutely no doubt that if that prescription showed up in the letters of Paul, that Christians would be jumping on it as evidence that our modern medical ethic is completely indebted to Christianity. And I think it's just overemphasized.
Yeah. Well, I think the fact that we notice examples of compassion in other cultures is a profoundly Christian thing itself. So, the great exemplar of compassion in the Bible really is the Good Samaritan, where Jesus basically inserts himself, thinly disguised as this beautiful stranger from outside the system, and it's the people of the Bible, people of the book, who are walking on by and leaving the beaten up guy on the side of the road to die. And Jesus has absolutely no qualms about calling the Samaritan the good guy in this story and saying, be less like those Bible guys, be more like that Samaritan. So completely, I want to say yay and amen to well done, Hippocrates, or whoever.
But where did he get that idea from?
I think there is such a thing as common grace, right? But the fact that common grace did not institutionalize things like hospitals, like you can have a Hippocratic Oath, Galen can have his manuals of here are the 4 humors and here's how to treat X, Y, and Z. That doesn't institutionalize this thing that is not just for the slave to return him to economic fruitfulness, and it's not just for soldiers to return them to military service, but it is for the poor and the sick as sick. That scaling and becoming institutional is a unique Christian contribution.
I can agree with that, but we need to separate out a few different things, right? Like, for example, you said the fact that we even notice compassion in these other texts is profoundly Christian. Well, I'm only noticing that there because you're telling me that it's something that it's sort of indebted to Christianity. So, of course, I'm then going to go and look elsewhere and say, well, look, it shows up here. Look, it shows up there.
Well, let's get to that claim, because it came up right near the beginning as well, Glenn, that you say the very fact we preference, compassion, equality, consent, freedom, and so on, is itself coming from our kind of Christianity that we've imbibed. And so when we say, oh look, that culture produced this, we're sort of effectively selecting based on our Christian values, and sort of saying, but the bad thing that culture produced, is something we now, Alex, I'm hearing you say, Glenn, that wasn't necessarily just a Christian foundation that produced that. There are these other streams that fed into that. You feel that actually you're not overemphasizing Christianity here. It is the bedrock, if you like, that those values and the way we talk about, why we look at compassion and equality and progress in other cultures and see them as good things, as essentially coming from the Christian worldview itself. I suppose I just want to get to the core of this. Why for you does it come back to Paul and the Bible? And I assume Galatians, where he talks about male, female, slave, free, and Jew or Greek, you're all one in Christ. You presumably think there is something foundational about that, regardless of whether it's popping up in other forms, in other cultures and places, that it was. Am I hearing from you, Glenn, that it's the fact that idea got universalized through Christian culture, rather than Platonic ideals or Hippocrates or something like that? It's the way it was what actually happened on the back of those, those words.
Yes, and there were some Enlightenment philosophers, for instance, who wanted to see abolition but didn't join the abolitionist movement. So, David Hume thought that slavery was not something that led to greater industry or ingenuity. He thought that, your free offer of your labor would lead to greater ingenuity. And so he had a kind of an abolitionist argument, but not for the sorts of reasons that we might resonate with today. And he had some pretty shocking remarks about race and about those sorts of things. And that's just an example, really, of you can have all sorts of predispositions towards any number of values and virtues, but there does seem to be this embedding of such values and virtues into communal life that has happened through the church. And just think about the church for a minute. You're in this Greco-Roman world in which it is absolutely segregated between male and female, slave and free, barbarian and citizen, and that sort of thing. You are to center yourself around Christ and Him crucified. You are to eat the bread together, which is something that people from different stratas of society absolutely would not do. You are to kiss one another. It's one of the most repeated kind of commands in the New Testament, 5 times, I think. It's this kissing campaign that you're meant to kind of do this. You are told that whereas the Romans are going to worship images in their temples, you are told instead that the image of God is one another, and you can serve the gods not by burning incense to Jupiter. You can serve the gods by serving one another. And that kind of horizontalizing of your vertical relationship with the gods into a kind of, the Clementine homilies in the early church were just these beautiful kind of depictions of the way that you serve Christ is in the weak, in the poor, they are, I think there's a specific reason why these ideals are not just Platonic ideals in a Christian frame, because Christians believe in incarnation, and Christians believe in the body of Christ, and Christians believe in community, and Christians believe in encountering Christ not simply by burning incense to an image, but encountering Christ by taking in the stranger, right? By visiting the prisoner, by feeding the hungry, by clothing the poor. The Christian impulse is not simply to hold these kinds of values. The Christian impulse is actually to embed them in a way that I think has led to the scaling of these kinds of institutions.
So then it's not the values which are Christian in origin. It's just the way that those values are used and institutionalized.
No, the stories, the Christian story births particular virtues, which have then become values, which have then become slogans, which have then...
A moment ago I asked about, we were speaking specifically about I suppose, equal treatment and strong oppressing the weak, and I gave you 2 examples that predate Christianity of those values being instantiated, actually in at least one case, a legal system. And when I asked you
the Hammurabi Code is the strong treating the weak. Or so that's an example of what
is presented as a law for the protection against the strong oppressing the weak. Now, if I'm supposed to believe that the strong not oppressing the weak is a result of the cross's inversion of Roman society, but you're saying that this view is uniquely Christian, and that Christianity, as Justin described, is the bedrock of a value. It's the bedrock even of values which predate it. And you responded by saying, but this idea of this Hippocratic ideal of treating everybody equally in a medical context wasn't institutionalized into hospitals until the Christians started doing that hundreds and hundreds of years later. Sure, that might be the case, and we can talk about why that might have been, and maybe that is a uniquely Christian development. But even if it is, we've still got this problem that the value itself predates Christianity.
Yeah.
So where did they get that from?
Oh, like I say, there's such a thing as common grace, but
I thought that it came from Christianity.
In the West, it has. In the West, it absolutely has.
But you said it couldn't have come with. This is why. So this is what I said happens earlier, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Earlier, I said that what happens is that when you point out that these values have independently evolved, people say, but we're talking about the West. Well, up and until you say that these values that we find in the West are uniquely indebted to Christianity and couldn't have existed without it.
In
Here's an
the
example.
form in which we encounter them in the West.
Okay, but if the form that you're talking about is essentially institutionalized hospitals, then the thesis has suddenly shrunk from like compassion is Christian to, compassion exists and Christians worked out that we should found this thing called a hospital in order to instantiate it, which is cool, but it's a much more mild thesis and much more in line with what I'm saying, which is that Christianity has done some cool things for the world, but it's a massive overreach to say that it's responsible for the values that drove those developments.
So are you denying that it is, in fact, responsible for hospitals and charities the way that we think?
No, of course not. I mean, hospitals in particular are absolutely Christian, at least in their modern conceptions. There are like, military hospitals and stuff like that exist, elsewhere and in the world. But of course, that's the case.
Right.
But the value that you're talking about, the compassion, the caring for the weak, the strong not oppressing the weak, it doesn't matter if they're male or female. Like, again, we look at Galatians and we see this, neither male nor female, neither Jew nor Greek, and we say, look how radical this was for Paul to say this, when hundreds of years earlier, the Hippocratic Oath says the same thing. It literally says male or female, rich or poor. It says the same kind of language.
Yeah.
And so, especially given that verse from Galatians is so brief and so relied upon, and it's in that sort of isolated element.
Yeah.
Like, where did they get this value from?
Well, they got that value. So I think Christians lean too much on Galatians 3:28 as though that has spawned by itself this sort of rights revolution. I think it describes a reality that is an incredible metaphysical reality that in Christ, as is theologically, this is where all the intellectual firepower of the early church and then of medieval times was kind of concentrated on the person of Christ, on hammering out Trinity, incarnation, and from that you get, Jesus of Nazareth became man for all, and therefore all humans are saved in the man Christ Jesus. I guess men and women actually share a nature. They must share an identical human nature because Christ has come for all, and he has come as a male. And yet male and female are different, and the Bible's very clear about the differences between male and female. But here you've got this radical equality at the level of ultimate reality for a Christian, that in Christ, who tramples down the great racial divide between Jew and Gentile, in Christ who dies the slave's death to rise up to liberate us all. So Galatians 3 verse 28 is, I think, a reflection on some profound theological truths. I think the profound theological truths are what people have been meditating on, and that has sort of rippled out, rather than going to the Bible as this sort of proof text, pick and mix.
The issue I have is that the progenitors of this kind of view try to paint the world that Christianity entered into as so barbaric and so unthinkable compared to our modern conditions, which is true to an extent, but such that like these particular values that we're talking about, almost as if they came out of nowhere. Like this Jesus figure shows up, and without him, there's no way that these ideas could have evolved. Like the tradition that he enters into is particularly brutal, and I think that if you're a Christian, you might think that's the reason why he showed up there, maybe, but it's an overstep to say that those values could only have come from Christianity. And maybe we spoke earlier about that might be the development that you're making on Tom Holland. Holland is saying as a historical contingency in the West, it's sort of a blossoming of a Christian tradition. You're going further and saying it could not have happened without Christianity. And I just really want to know where you think these other people got it from.
Oh, this is, okay.
But like, where do you think they got it? I mean, you said that there's such thing as a common grace, but that when we're talking about specific values, it's either the case that there's like this common intuition that people can have anyway, in which case it's not like Christianity as a historical force that's responsible for those values, or Christianity is responsible for those values, in which case they couldn't have predated Christianity, which they did.
It depends what we're talking about in terms of. I'll have to go back and watch the tape later for at what point did I say unthinkable. But
maybe not unthinkable, but
yeah.
Well, maybe you did. I don't know.
But yeah, I did use the word unthinkable. But was it about things like such as the secular is definitely a Christian-y kind of a thing that gets developed into separation of church and state, that gets developed into the freedom of religion, that is now taken to mean the freedom from religion, and we're all secular people now. That is, we're some considerable distance from the Christian origins at that point, but that kind of development is unthinkable outside of the Christian trajectory that gave us that. And therefore, of course, we're in a society, we're in the only society on the planet that's ever thought of itself in religionless terms, right?
Can I ask you a question? Like, one problem I have with this is that it seems like basically anything that the West does or is said to do can in some vague way be traced back to the Bible or the Christian tradition in one way or another. Now, if that's not the case, because that would be a little bit too weak of a principle, what would be a falsifying condition? Like, if there was something that were true in the West, something that people did, something that people accepted morally, is there an example of such a thing that would make you say, okay, that's not grounded in Christianity? Yeah. In a way that you don't think I could pull a similar trick of sort of saying, yeah, but this biblical story or this church tradition or whatever, can you think of an example of something society could be doing that would disallow you, that would falsify the idea that it's Christian in origin?
So this is actually the difference between me and Tom, which is not the difference that you identified. The difference between me and Tom is for me to be able to say, I think there is a Christianity beyond which we have developed ideas, and we've developed ideas with Romanticism, for instance. Yeah. Again, Romanticism is unthinkable without this tradition of the person that's come, through the scriptures and through meditation on the persons of the Trinity, and there's definitely some very Christian backstory to the individual. We invented the individual, Larry Seidentop's great book, but we've also invented individualism. We've got this intense first personal sense that I think has turned into a romanticized kind of self, and takes the West in all sorts of directions contra to what the Bible is. So I'm not trying to make the point that, it's easy to say the modern West is very pro-gay and the Bible's very anti-gay, and I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that, because if I said that to you, if I said, the LGBT movement is anti-Bible, you could say, yeah, but the motivations behind the LGBT movement are essentially Christian. What I'm saying is, can you think of a single example of something the West could be doing that would make you say, actually, no, that's definitely not Christian? Industrial scale abortion?
Okay, right. So if, and you don't think the West is doing that?
It's totally doing that.
So when you say
that, that's not very Christian.
So when you say that Western civilization, warts and all, is indebted to Christianity, this is an example of a massive part of modern Western culture, which has got nothing to do with Christianity. It's actually contra Christianity.
100%.
But many people, if you ask people on the street, I think popular consensus, especially in the UK, is that abortion is fine, at least up to a certain point. It seems to be a settled issue here.
Yeah.
So the air that those people are breathing is profoundly unchristian.
Which I say in the book. And what I say in the book is, what's fascinating at that point is that they're doing what is I consider to be a pagan practice for some profoundly Christian reasons. And it's healthcare, right? It's about bodily autonomy.
But
and
look,
rights.
I asked you a second ago for an
right.
example of something which you would say is not not an example of a flourishing of Christianity. You said industrial abortion.
Yep.
When I said, well, that means it's not Christian, you said, but they're actually doing a very Christian thing.
No, they're not doing a Christian thing.
You said that they're motivated by Christian principles.
No, I don't think they're motivated by Christian principles. I just think the way you are able to forward some quite pagan ends in a modern society, and there's lots of pagan stuff that we do, you do tend to have to use some Christian language in order to do it, or Christian-ish language in order to do something profoundly un-Christian.
Okay, so once again then, we've sort of landed on this thing, industrial abortion, which you say that to buttress in Western civilization, you need to use Christian language. What I'm looking for is a falsifying condition then, something which the West could be doing, which you could not make that argument for. It seems like it doesn't matter what you point to. The fact that you can point to the gay rights movement, to feminism, even to industrial abortion, and still say that, ultimately there's some Christian influence going on here. Makes
you're
me
very
think
much
that
you're mischaracterizing me
anything,
there. You mischaracterized me there quite substantially there. I think it's a totally pagan practice which we are heading full steam towards. I think euthanasia is another kind of pagan practice that it is utterly in keeping with paganism, not in keeping with Christianity. But even the reasons that are given for it some of them are starting to be reasons, such as, well, you know, the NHS is creaking at the seams, and you know, this might be cheaper. You know, some of those sorts of justifications are being given, which are pagan kinds of justifications for pagan kinds of practices. But you're looking for falsifiability when we're not talking about science. Okay, so falsifiability works brilliantly if you've got population A, population B, and a control group, and let's run the experiment, and let's look at the results, and we'll ABC test it. Okay, you cannot do that with the past. You literally, we look back at the past. There is not A, B, or C past. There is only A, and that A has been 20 centuries of some very profound Christianization, and we've come out the other end of 20 centuries of very strong Christianization. And the extraordinary thing is that so many people are able to think of Tom Holland's thesis as wild, or, you know, it's an incredibly modest thesis, which I think is quite obvious. And it's quite obvious to everyone else around the world. When everyone else comes to the UK, they're just like, well, I've come to a Christian country, haven't I?
You think that?
Right.
You think people come to the UK and think, wow, how profoundly Christian this place is?
Yeah.
You think you walk around
Have you talked to immigrants? They come. I've come to this country. It seems to be a Christian country. Now, devout Muslims might look into the West and think, this is what Christianity is. It has become so decadent. It is so, self-obsessed, etc., etc., etc. But their idea, because they don't have a separation of church and state, because they don't have the secular.
I mean, this is impossible to prove. I mean, I don't know. I suppose it depends on who you ask. But anybody listening, if they visited the UK, like walked around London and thought, wow, how profoundly Christian everything is here. I'd like to speak
from another religious point of view. From another religious point of view, a Chinese person comes to the UK. They are thinking that it's Christian, right? Right? A Muslim person comes to the UK. They say, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who we've both spoken to, when she went to the Netherlands, she just thought it was a Christian country, right? You know,
I guess we should avoid this. This is essentially like it's almost anecdotal, but the people who give the anecdotes aren't even here. So this is kind of an impossible thread to follow.
But my point is that the falsifiability thing is illegitimate, because counterfactuals in history are just notoriously...
The reason I'm asking is because, for example, if I were to say, and this is an oversimplification, but if I were to say something like, I think that Western civilization is profoundly vegan, you would say, I don't think that's true, because the West might...
Because let's look at the history.
Because the West just like serves hot dogs like all over the place, and it'd be like, okay, actually, fair enough. That shows that maybe society isn't vegan. Now, if we lived in a vegan world where everyone was vegan, and I could say, the West is profoundly vegan, you might ask me, yeah, but you could say that about anything. What would be an example of a reality where you wouldn't be able to say that? And I would say, well, if people were serving, hot dogs everywhere, I don't think it would be vegan. And that would be that. What I'm saying is,
okay.
If you want to say that the West we find ourselves in is profoundly Christian, I'm saying what could be true about the West that would make it unchristian?
I think we're missing each other.
All right. Maybe. But you get the question I'm asking now? Like, what could be
true
you can connect about the West that would make it unchristian?
Yeah. I think we've all and this is what I was trying to communicate back at the beginning. Whereas you said about blossoming, everything that happens within the West is just a further blossoming of what Christianity is. What I'm trying to say is, no, I think there are things that are Christian and things that are not, and I think there's ways of crossing over that line in some quite decisive ways. We've spoken about. And interestingly, abortion and euthanasia are about the dignity of the human person and Imago Dei issues, if you ask me. So, and I think there are many more like that. So I'm not saying that everything in the West is Christian, but I am saying that the history that has got us here has been profoundly Christianized, and I don't think people properly acknowledge that.
It's the air we breathe, right? And what I'm asking is in a country where abortion is essentially a settled issue, that Christians protest against, but like politically it would be insane to imagine like a sort of a thoroughgoing pro-life movement getting going in Parliament. I mean, maybe one day, but at least for now, is the air that they're breathing Christian?
The moral intuitions that they are using to argue for a profoundly pagan practice are to do with gender equality, the rights of...
So is there anything that you could not say that about?
Yeah, if it's just, I don't care, right? Hashtag shout your abortion. That's not Christian. Like, I think you're mistaking me for.
And obviously, you feel that this falsification thing that Alex wants to press on here isn't necessarily the way to look at history. I mean, to some extent, I understand Glen saying here that actually, yeah, in a sense, yes, everything has some root in Christianity because the West is so thoroughly influenced by it. But not everything is therefore Christian that comes out of that, because obviously it goes off in different directions. But even the things that are not Christian have tended to be justified still by reference to Christian ideals. I want to just have a quick gear change here, and it's been absolutely brilliant, and I've been enjoying every moment of it. But so far, the conversation has been very much you brilliantly testing Glen's thesis here, Alex, and I want to maybe sort of shift things a little bit more to kind of, okay, where does Alex get his? Where is your view on all of this in terms of the idea of a fundamental moral reality of ideas around compassion, progress, freedom, equality, and all of those things? One of the sort of chapters of Glen's book is called Choose Your Miracle, and he's essentially saying, look, this idea that in the secular West, these ideas of compassion, equality, progress, and so on have just kind of come out of the ether is a sort of miraculous claim. It's a sort of, no, they have to be grounded in something. Glen's case is they're grounded in the Christian story, and that's grounded ultimately in the idea of there being a God who creates a moral universe out of which we are, essentially judged against. Do you have a view as an atheist of what this morality is? Is it something that is just essentially a byproduct of a socio-cultural evolutionary process which works and people get on with and produces the kind of goods that our self-interest and survival are prone towards? Do you have any sense that there is a kind of fundamental moral reality that actually exists, some Platonic realm perhaps?
No, I don't think so.
All right.
I mean,
tell us where you are, and I'd just love to hear Glen sort of teasing that out, as well as to what your grounding is. Glen's is obviously that we need the Christian story to make sense of these ideals. I suspect you've got a different account.
Well, I'm an ethical emotivist.
Okay.
I think that ethical expressions are emotional expressions, and it's a lot of people find that quite troubling. You might say, oh, but then how can you say this is objectively wrong and that's, and it's like, well, like I can't. I don't think that objective morality exists. I mean,
just for the folk who are watching or listening who don't have the background in ethical emotivism, just a brief summary of what
I don't think that there is some truth in the universe that exists, that there are these qualities called goodness and badness and should and shouldn't that are real and actually exist and are true in the same way this table exists right here. I don't think that's the case. I think that when you pay attention to what you're doing, when you're moralizing, you're essentially expressing an emotion. It's not the same as ethical subjectivism, right? Like, famously for an ethical emotivist, if you say that murder is wrong, it's like sort of saying the word murder and then putting an angry emoji and an exclamation mark next to it. It doesn't have truth value. It's not the kind of thing that can be true or false. It's not, well, is that just subjectively true or is it object? It's like, it's an expression. It's not the same thing as, like, murder is wrong doesn't translate to I don't like murder, because that could be true or false. It could be true that I don't like murder. It's a claim about my own psychology. For an emotivist, murder is wrong is just an expression of that distaste. Now, the thing is, for a lot of people, that's very uncomfortable, and we can talk about that if you like. I think it's tangential to the issue of like whether Western values are Christian, because I don't think Western values historically have been emotivist, right? I wouldn't claim that they've been emotivist. I wouldn't claim that like emotivism is going to console you. It's not going to make you feel any better. And if you say to me, but doesn't that sort of leave you in this hole or that hole? I might just say, yeah, it totally does. But I do think that's slightly tangential to the point. I mean, we can talk about it if you like, but look, I want to emphasize that the reason I'm here is not to provide a better grounding for Western values, like is in their truth. I'm trying to offer a more, I think, fair.
We are moving, obviously, from a sort of historical...
An internal critique of my position to see if it's consistent.
And the issue that I have is, it seems like, I mean, an example that comes to mind for me, for example, just sort of picking one out of thin air, as it were, is something like family, right? Let's just take something like family. I can just imagine, right? that if Western civilization had a really strong emphasis on family, in the way that some Asian cultures do, that like it was like one of our most important moral intuitions, that you live with your grandparents and you look after them, people could say, well, this is Christian, because look at the way that the Bible instructs you to honor your father and mother. It's like the only people you honor above your father and mother are God. Like it's so crucial that this is, the most important thing, right? And yet we live in a highly individualistic culture where people don't. They value their family, but not in that kind of way, and we value our own sort of sense of self. But you can imagine an even more individualistic culture that didn't do that at all, and people would still say, oh, but this is foundationally Christian, because look at the way that Jesus said that you should be willing to hate your mother and hate your father and prefer me. Like, it's just so, it doesn't matter which way you go, strong family, anti-family. If we had lived in a world where the abolitionist movement didn't get going and everyone was still okay with slavery, where would people still be pointing to justify it? They'd be pointing to the Bible. So it doesn't matter if we have it or we
Is it
don't.
better that abolition has happened?
As an emotivist, I can say yes, but I think I'm expressing an emotion there.
Okay. And as an emotivist, what would you have said in 1800 if you were in the House of Commons and you were called upon, William Wilberforce is sick, Alex O'Connor needs to address the abolitionist cause? What would you say from your...
I'm not sure what I would have said, because I'm not sure if I would have been an emotivist in the 1800s, because I don't think the position had been invented yet. So I might have believed in some kind of objective moral principle that I might have appealed to. I might well have been a Christian and appealed to those principles too, but I might not have been. I might have been like Lincoln, a man who privately was reported to sort of have no belief in Jesus as personal Lord and Saviour, but just had a conviction that something about this was wrong. I don't know what I would have said at the time. But whether or not I could have rightfully condemned slavery then or done so now, I think is a separate question as to whether Christianity is the historical force that caused that abolitionist movement.
Oh, do you doubt that it was Christianity that caused...
In the UK, Wilberforce is, of course, deeply convicted of his religious beliefs, and the man who convinced him to bring it to Parliament, who had written an essay in Latin for Cambridge University about his tutor had just set him this sort of like, is it okay to own other human beings? And he wrote this essay in Latin and was like, hold on a moment. And he reports sort of being on a long journey and feeling like God had spoken to him and he had this mission. Yeah, no doubt. That's the English tradition. In America, I'm not so sure. Certainly not in Haiti. In France, when does abolition happen? Well, after the French Revolution, which is a profoundly secularizing influence on France. So it depends on where you look. In other words, yes, maybe I would be happy to grant that in the UK there is a profoundly Christian element to abolitionism. But to say that it had to be Christian is to ignore what happened in France and to ignore what happened in Haiti, and I think to ignore what happened in America.
So, in France it was reversed by Napoleon.
That's right.
I think because there are some profoundly utilitarian arguments being used alongside a whole bunch of rights language. Where do they get the rights language from? Where did they get some of their campaigns from? And it was the Abolition Society in the UK.
But why was it abolished
France.
before it was reinstated by Napoleon? Why was it abolished?
Why was it abolished? For because of both Christian-ish reasons in terms of rights, and because of some utilitarian arguments, such as David Hume's kind of arguments, that you don't get ingenuity and you don't get industry.
But this is it, isn't it? Within not that long a period of time, we go from the French abolishing it and then reinstating it. And when they abolished it, that was probably due to Christian influence. But when they reinstated it, no, that was nothing to do with Christianity.
I'm just telling you a history of what has happened, and it was reversed. And by the way, France actually abolished slavery in 1400, right? And I mean, slavery, the long slow burn of abolitionism happened in medieval Europe, 700 years earlier, right? So I would say that Christianity abolished slavery twice. One was a long slow burn of a kind of a sacramental approach, and the second was very much a preacher-led abolitionism, but that
But if you want to own the Christian element of the abolitionist movement, you have to also own the Christian element of the anti-abolitionist movement, which is just as strong.
Sure.
In America, the issue was settled with physical violence.
Yeah.
And if the other side had won, you'd have a just as Christian nation appealing to exactly the same God and the same Bible and the same Christian tradition to say that they were right.
Actually, not the same Bible. They actually did what Marcion proposed. And they did what I hear you wanting to do.
They're talking about the slave Bible.
The slave Bible. To get rid of 90% of the Old Testament and 50%.
90%?
Yeah. And then 50% of the New Testament. Those slave owners were terrified of the Bible. They were terrified of the whole Bible. And I would say that the Bible was in the hands of abolitionist preachers, and Frederick Douglass said that the image of God on page 1 of the Bible was a hammer in the hands of the abolitionists. And I think it was a profoundly spiritual, religious, Christian, evangelical and Quaker-led movement.
In the United Kingdom, I think so, yes. But
which then, through international law, gets rolled out.
Well, maybe, but I don't think it's as simple as that. I mean, well, the slave Bible, I think, was designed for British colonies. And of course, the slave Bible is not so much... I think people think about this wrong. I think when people look at the slave Bible, they think of it as an edited Bible. But like you say, like 90% of the Old Testament is gone. This is not an edited Bible. This is a sort of compilation of biblical quotes. It's a bit like if I had a book that said, like, here is a book of selected psalms for help in overcoming grief, right? And you gave that to me. I wouldn't say you've taken a Bible and you've edited it and you've censored it. No, it's a collection. Now, what did they take out? Things like the Exodus story. Why? Because people might read the Exodus story and be filled with these delusions of grandeur about...
Which is what the black church was, and that was the Negro spirituals that they sang.
But the question is, who is actually misreading the story of the Exodus? Is it the abolitionists?
And it's not the black church, is it? The black church got it right.
I don't think that they did.
Okay.
I don't think that they did. Because what happened in the Exodus? The Jews were enslaved in Egypt. God makes a promise to Abraham. He fulfills that promise, which starts with the emancipation of the Jews from Egypt. And what is the first thing that the Jews immediately start doing? They start taking slaves of their own from the nations around them. The reason why the Jews were freed from slavery in Egypt is not because God is anti-slavery. It's because the Jews were his chosen people, to the extent that as soon as they were emancipated from the Egyptians, God gave them permission to take slaves from the nations around them. If God was anti-slavery, he would have put an end to it full stop there and then. But he wasn't. And so, what does this mean? It means that the actual, a thorough reading of the Bible, of the Old Testament, will tell you that this Exodus story with these stories of, let my people go, was a profoundly Israelite-specific motivation, that as soon as they left Egypt, they started taking slaves of their own. Now, I have no doubt that if I were a slave owner who was trying to convince my slaves not to want to sort of rise up against me, that if I gave them the Exodus, they might read that and go, hey, we can do what the Israelites did. And that might still be enough reason for me to take it out of the Bible and not let them read it. But to say that that's the message of the Old Testament, I think is profoundly mistaken.
Well, I think you're calling, those enslaved people and their discovery of faith in Scripture, you're saying that they've got that wrong. And I don't think it's Stockholm Syndrome. I think this is a profound sense of feeling understood as an oppressed people in a furnace of affliction. And the Negro spirituals were very profoundly Old Testament focused, actually. I don't like to hear shade thrown at the Old Testament. I think the doctrine of the Imago Dei, the idea in Genesis 1 and 2 that humanity are made to have dominion rather than to be slaves. Lauda Equiano kind of makes that huge point that if God did not make man slave, how dare man make man slave, right? You've got the idea of the Exodus, the idea of people in suffering. Harriet Tubman was the great Moses, in the black church in America, the Underground Railway, bringing people up. It was a profoundly spiritual movement, biblical movement, Old Testament movement. And this is the way that Christians have been reading the Bible, right? Absolutely, there are others like slave owners who will preach other verses. They'll preach the kind of verses that
from the same book
you've raised up from the same book. But that's because it's a story, right?
Such as what?
Right?
Such as what? Like what would they quote?
I
mean, I've granted that an emancipated slave could quote that part of Exodus, the liberation from Egypt. What part of Exodus could a slave owner quote?
Exodus 21,
which says
it starts out by saying if the slave owner kills the slave, then it's the death penalty for him. If he doesn't, then he is not to be avenged.
Why?
In that way.
Why?
What does it say?
Because the slave is his property.
The slave is his silver or
his
whatever.
Silver, which means property.
Right. Because if you are in a case, I mean, it's all case law, isn't it, in Exodus? So, no, let me say. If you are to judge a case where you are not certain why this slave died, if you were to judge that case, the judge in that circumstance is to think, well, is he really going to destroy his property in that sense. That would be foolish for him to do. It was about the justice. It was about the application of that justice to that particular instance. And then the next thing it says, if he so much as knocks out a tooth of that slave, the slave goes free, right? Okay. Now we all read this with a profound sense of discomfort. But I think what's going on is like when Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19 about divorce. God hates divorce. He says that very clearly in the Old Testament. My divorced friends feel very understood by that verse because they hate it and yet have experienced it as a cruel necessity. God hates divorce, and yet there are all sorts of divorce laws, right, in the Old Testament as well.
What divorce laws
right.
are there? There's one instance. It's like Deuteronomy 5 or something, or 20 verses 1 to 5. That's it, and it just says that if a man finds something dishonorable in his wife and issues her divorce papers, and that she goes and marries someone else, and then he divorces her, that he can't marry her again. That's it.
Yeah, but this is and it's about second wives and that kind of that's
all.
21.
That's what it is.
So God is regulating things that He hates, right? God is regulating things that are profoundly non-ideal, right? And so the Matthew 19 thing is there was a pattern in creation in Genesis 1 and 2. We have fallen down into a very unfortunate situation, very non-ideal, hardness of heart. God regulates that totally non-ideal situation, which Christ has then come to redeem into the future.
Is already a renegotiation of the divorce stuff. I mean, in Mark, it's you can't divorce someone for any reason. In Matthew, it becomes you can't divorce them for any reason except for adultery. There's a constant renegotiation going on in the Bible. Surely you would agree that the reading of the Exodus story. Sorry, Justin. I know you're also. We're kind of running out of time. I don't know if that's a limit of the show or a limit of us, but I'd be happy to go on for as long as you
we
like.
can go on a bit longer.
This is really important, right? Because the Exodus story, is constantly referred to as a sort of anti-slavery essence.
Well, it's constantly referred to within the Hebrew Bible.
For the Israelites, quite clearly. This is the Israelite freedom from Egypt because of the covenant that God made with them. It says that God remembered the covenant he made with Abraham, and so this happened. And so the Exodus occurs because of the covenant he made with Israel. As soon as Israel have escaped the Egyptians, they start taking slaves. And it's not just if you poke out because firstly, where did they get these slaves from? Secondly, it's not just these kind of regulations. It's instructions on how to go and get them. Because bear in mind, the laws that you're talking about there in Exodus 21 are about Israelite Hebrew bondservants, right? There's quite clearly a distinction between Hebrew bondservants and slaves taken from the nations around you. Leviticus is quite clear. Your male and female slaves may come from the nations around you. From them you may buy and sell slaves. You may also purchase some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clan, and they will become your property for life. You can bequeath them to your children as inheritable property, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly.
The Jew-Gentile distinction.
Exactly. So what I'm saying is that I'm reading this text, right? And I'm seeing God not just regulating something that he hates, but proactively giving permission to go and do something. It's not just, I know you've got slaves that are a hangover from some condition that you're in. And, what I'm going to say is regulated in this way or that way. It's like, you may go and get slaves from the foreign lands. Don't do it to your fellow Israelites, but you may go and get them from the nations around you. And quite clearly, when you read this as a totality, you've got Israel as God's chosen people, so they shall not be slaves because they're God's chosen people. But once they're freed from slavery, they get to take slaves in themselves. And so when you ask who's misreading this story, if somebody is reading that story of the Exodus from Egypt and saying that's about universal abolition and just neglecting to mention the fact...
But no one says it's
then
about
I think that they are the ones who are misreading.
They're saying
yes.
there's a fulfillment in Christ in that he comes as Jubilee. The other thing that's said in Leviticus 25 is just this extraordinary year of Jubilee in which debts get cancelled and you return to your land and the amazing social justice that would happen if we had a year of Jubilee in the year 2025. It would be an extraordinarily disruptive event. There's a Jubilee Center that's been going for about 40 years now. We're a think tank, people trying to think about what does debt relief mean in the light of even a chapter from which those other verses are mentioned, because the Old Testament is really prioritizing very much the sojourner, the outsider, the alien, the widow, and what's the three? The poor, the widow, and the sojourner is this sort of this triad of those in need. And there's all sorts of Old Testament development. There's all sorts of stuff that we take great issue with and find very, very difficult. But the whole sweep is that Jesus is the Son of God with a capital S, summing up the Old Testament, dying under a curse, rising up again to have a spiritual exodus for the nations. So that, yes, there had to be a nation, and that nation had to be treated differently if there's going to be an incarnation. If Christ is to become man, he has to become a certain kind of man. He has to become a certain kind of man from a certain kind of place. And that certain kind of place, if he's going to come in the time and place where he comes, is going to have to be embroiled in the kinds of brutalities that we've been mentioning. And that kind of nation also has to be delimited. If the seed of Abraham is going to be born into the world, then there needs to be a certain nation that has certain rules to it, and you see God kind of protecting that seed until Christ comes, fulfills that, dies on the cross, dies the slave's death, rises up again. And the Christian understanding is that he has brought a jubilee for the nations and for everybody. And that is the way, and the difficulties that every Christian has with the individual verses that you're raising, I think quite legitimately you want to put them in the context of the grand story that's being told in the Bible. So when Christians say the Bible says X, Y, and Z, what they don't mean is if we were to aggregate all these different propositions and synthesize some kind of philosophy, that's what we would get. What we're saying is that those verses are pointing and being swept up into a grand narrative that culminates in Christ. And when we sit again at the bottom of the cross and look at this one who dies the slave's death in order to liberate the world, that is the story that has birthed this unique emancipatory movement.
Okay, I'm going to call time. I do apologize, Alex, because we could always go back and forth on this, and I understand that there's always going to, but if I can try to summarize, something of where we've got to, I think we're at this point where you're saying the Bible has been used by lots of different people in lots of different ways. And yes, some people looked at verses that seem to establish emancipation and abolition. Others used the verses to justify their slave keeping and so on. In the bigger scheme, I think as you've argued throughout this conversation, Alex, you're saying there's lots of different tributaries that go into where we find ourselves today. And in the UK, yes, certainly evangelical abolitionists were inspired by the verses that they chose to read in Scripture. Glen's saying, no, there really is a trajectory, if you like, notwithstanding those troubling verses, that you've already. But I suspect Glen's also saying the reason you find those verses troubling, Alex, is again because of this Christian worldview that is essentially. And what's interesting is, I think this does take us back to the emotivism piece, and I just want to spend a little bit more time exploring that, because I guess I want you first of all to say, what's your problem with Alex just saying, well, I am just, my views on what's moral and not are a product of the way I feel about things. Is that do you think that a grounding in the Christian story is a better grounding for some reason than Alex's grounding on why he prefers freedom to slavery and so on?
I'm not sure that Alex operates purely as an emotivist, and I sensed you rowing back from the idea of progress. I think we've at some point we were talking about sort of moral progress towards certain sorts of things, and I think that on your view, the idea of some kind of objective ideal to which we're tending might not be consistent.
Yeah, of course, no, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that for me raises the question, are you... It seems like your sensibilities are towards being outraged with the same kind of outrage that all three of us kind of feel when Exodus 21 is mentioned, or certain verses in the Old Testament. I think our emotions are all piqued by these things, and I guess I just return to the point that it seems fairly obvious to me that what it is that we three share at that point is not a meta-ethical theory at all. We have quite different meta-ethical theories and very similar moral intuitions. And I think those moral intuitions have a historical and history behind them, and that's why we're having the debate that we're having, and so that's kind of I guess, is that what you mean by?
I guess that's where I was coming from. Is your emotivism is the types of emotions you have around these moral issues are themselves a consequence, Glen would argue, of the Christian culture in which you've been raised, and you might be having a very different set of emotions had you been born in another time, place, or culture.
I've no doubt.
Yeah, and I suppose what we're moving from here is a strictly kind of question about the historical contingency of morality on Christianity or other things, to the question, the more kind of philosophical question of, is there are we comfortable with this? Is it sort of, are we happy that we just have the morality that we happen to have been handed down by the cultures that are, that we're part of, and there isn't actually a true morality that actually underlies reality? Are you kind of, is that just a bitter pill you're happy to swallow?
I'm happy to answer that in more depth. Depending on the limitations of time, I would like an opportunity to respond to what Glen said before, which will determine how long I will spend on this emotivism question.
Okay, so you want to respond to what Glen had to say about the big picture of Scripture. Okay.
I wasn't the one who said that, like, a lot of the focus that black abolitionists and civil rights advocates had was on the Old Testament. And when I said that there is this misreading of the Old Testament, that this Exodus story can be universalized and is in fact only about the Israelites, and that there are other verses which will work in the opposite direction, which much more accurately depict the idea to take slaves if you're not part of the chosen nation. And I said that was the misreading. You act surprised. What I want to say is that if you take Christianity, especially if you take the Bible, and we're not just talking about the Old Testament here, the very best you get is a condemnation of the kind of slavery that was practiced in the transatlantic period. That is the brutality of it. Quite clearly, there are some restrictions in the Old Testament, and when it comes to the New Testament, St. Paul...
Well, man stealing is out in both Old and New Testaments,
yeah,
right?
And in fact, in your book, I was kind of shocked that when it came to this issue of like equality and talking about slavery and abolitionists, the only verse mentioned about slavery from the Bible was this brief mention that you give to the fact that kidnapping, as you put it, is condemned in the Old and the New Testament. As you say, man stealing, right? This is the illegal or unauthorized taking of another human being. Stealing doesn't just mean taking, it means unauthorized taking. If you've been given the authority to take slaves from the nations around you, then that wouldn't count as stealing. And so, yes, man stealing is condemned, but that wouldn't include the kind of stealing or the kind of taking which is permitted by the Bible, which is to say, taking slaves from the nations around you and bequeathing them to your children as inheritable property. It's so easy to say that, like, well, kidnapping is condemned. But that's like me saying, well, the Israelites never could have killed anybody because murder is quite clearly condemned in the Old Testament. Yeah, murder, which is the unjustified killing. But when they're killing the children of the Amalekites and the animals and the donkeys and the camels and the infants, well, that's not murder because they were given permission. And so it'd be way too easy for me to say, oh no, they never could have done that because murder is condemned. Because that doesn't include the rightful killing of infants in that case. And here, yeah, man stealing is condemned, but this wouldn't be stealing, this would be rightful taking. Like, what you would get is, by the time you get to the New Testament, you get St. Paul talking about how masters should be good to their slaves, right? And so,
if they can seek their freedom, they should.
You're not
sending back Onesimus.
Yeah, that's a can of worms in itself. But yes, so you're getting this idea that masters should be good to their slaves and all of this kind of stuff, but you are not getting abolitionism. At the very best, what you get is the idea that the way that slavery was being done in the transatlantic period was wrong. But abolitionism would be seen as a massive overstep, especially in the case of 1 Peter, where Peter writes, or allegedly Peter writes, that slaves should be obedient to their masters, not just the good ones, but also the cruel and unjust ones. And I think it is so important to point out that when you say, like, well, yeah, you look at like Exodus 21 and you look at Leviticus and you look at Deuteronomy where it's giving instructions on how to take slaves, but that was kind of a bit like the divorce laws, and it's sort of like, God was allowing something that he didn't like. But when it comes to the Exodus, which I read as a specific fulfillment of a promise given to a particular people who then went on to enslave other people,
you must
we're
know
supposed
that it's
to read this
foundational to the Hebrew Bible. You must understand that the God of the Old Testament is the God who brought his people up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That is how the Ten Commandments begin. You must understand that is the way that God is described as the liberator.
Yes, of the Israelites. His chosen people,
right,
who then go and enslave people from the nations around them.
Yeah, I know, and I wish that were not so, but you then get Jesus as the one risen from the dead to be the liberator of the world, right? And therefore, no wonder the Apostle Paul is going to say, within the existence of this brutality called slavery, then slaves, if you can seek your freedom, get it. Masters, do not mistreat your slaves because you have a master, and nobody in this church is Lord except Jesus, and we are all brothers and sisters, and we're going to kiss one another, whether you're slave or free, whether you're Jew or Gentile, whether you're man or woman, we're going to eat together. Right?
But I've made this point about Galatians 3:28 in particular before, that when Paul says things like there is neither male nor female, he's clearly not a gender abolitionist. I know we agree on this, right? Like, he's clearly
the conjunctions change, like man and woman is not the same conjunction as used for slave or free or Jew or Gentile.
Yeah, but what do you think? What do you think the point is that's being made there?
The point is that we are all one in Christ Jesus, right?
But do you think that this is any attempt to abolish earthly practices and traditions?
What do you mean by abolish? Because that is to bring a very modern view of politics.
Or to counterfeit.
Was Paul meant to say, let's get a petition going, and if we get 100,000 signatories, we can go to Caesar and we'll get a debate in the Senate about
I should have said, masters, let your slaves go.
Well, there were literally laws by which they could not do that. So either side of the year dot in 2 BC and in 6 AD, it was literally illegal to manumit your entire slave population, because the social upheaval of abolition, not only in the first century, but the social abolition of abolition even in the 19th century, caused a debt that the Britain was paying off up until 2015.
It also was illegal for a time in the early Roman Empire. Christianity.
Yes.
But they still practiced that because they thought it was the right thing to do.
Right.
Like, if I'm now being told that Paul, who's not just, as I see him, an early Christian writer, but the author of eternal scripture, is now not condemning something which has come to be one of the most foundational ethical questions of Western civilization, because
ought he to have said so? I mean, so the first wholesale condemnation of slavery, is Gregory of Nyssa, about 379 AD. The first in human history. We are the heirs of a tradition that makes us see slavery as obviously wrong. That is unique, right? That is unique in history. Okay. We find it impossible to think ourselves back into the sandals of a first century person or a fourth century person, right? There is an unthinkable character to abolitionism. We might wish that Paul had written something like Gregory of Nyssa wrote for Christian reasons when he was actually preaching on an Old Testament scripture from Ecclesiastes. We might wish that he had condemned the practice wholesale and done that. To be honest, I think he does what you would expect a missionary to do to a brutal culture, which is to work within the structures and to sow the seed.
Right.
And you have the long, slow burn, right? And God is patient, bafflingly, infuriatingly patient.
But why is he not patient with things like polytheism? Polytheism was widespread, right, like in the ancient world. And yet when God delivers his monotheistic message to the Jews, it's to the extent that if they start worshipping other gods, it's immediately punishable by death.
We're talking about the New Testament now. So on the polytheism issue, I think 1 Corinthians is a great example of how Paul is working within the structures of the day. And what do? Do I eat this kebab? Well, the meat was sacrificed to another god. What do I have to do about that? He's not saying we need to abolish the gods.
He doesn't say, like, if you worship another god, just make sure that you speak to Jesus afterwards. It's like, don't do that, because that's wrong. And and another thing that's illegal is not taking part in the imperial cult of Rome at a time. There's this idea that if you won't sign a slip of paper that with two witnesses saying that you pledge your allegiance and worship the Roman emperor god, but Christians would refuse to do that. So
should he have done? Should Paul? What should Paul have written?
Oh, I don't know. I mean.
No, you sounded very sure about what you thought Paul should
No.
write.
What I'm saying is that if you want to claim that Paul is in part responsible for this abolitionist tendency, then you have to say that that's what he should have written.
No, I don't. I don't have to do that, because it's yeast working through dough, right? And this is okay. Christianity has ended slavery both in the long, slow burn of the sacramental way. Medieval Christendom, basically, it dissolves away. Because you're baptizing every member of your household, you're kissing them, you're eating with them. It's and there are other economic factors at play, and plagues are smashing through things, and that's going to have massive social implications as well. But in Christendom, it melts away. It comes back through the New World slavery. It is abolished again. Christianity has done it twice. Now, I was thinking about this analogy this morning. One way I could say to you about going to the moon, right? I could say to you, did you know that NASA between 1958 and 1972 failed to get to the moon as much as it did get to the moon, in terms of trying to land some kind of spacecraft on the moon? Do you know they failed a heck of a lot? The Christians have been on the wrong side of this question quite a lot, but the overarching message that you should receive is that no one has walked on the moon except a NASA astronaut. Only Americans have walked on the moon. It is these Christian ideals that have proved themselves to be remarkably abolitionist in ways that others haven't. And we're having an argument about the Bible not being sufficiently abolitionist. And this seems to be proving the thesis, right? That
the New Testament not being sufficiently abolitionist, and the Old Testament
the whole Bible culminating in Christ crucified,
the Old Testament being a really bad place to turn if you're trying to justify the abolitionist.
We aren't going to get to agreement on this.
And for example, on the NASA thing, right? If it's not just, I mean, I understand what you're saying. It's like, NASA have been to the moon, and there are times when they've tried and failed or not tried at all. But imagine if there was a period where NASA was proactively discouraging people from going to the moon. Like China or someone just wants to go to the moon, or someone in NASA wants to go there, and NASA go, no, don't do that, because the essence of our organization tells us that
you would still ask NASA, like, how do you get to the moon? They would still be the people you would look to.
I'll tell you what, I'll give you one thing in closing, and I promise we'll close it.
All right.
I think this is, and it's not quite a tangent. The one thing that we didn't touch on, which I'm not going to open up as a can of worms, is the concept of consent. And the reason I'm bringing it there is because we've already talked about this concept of equality. And I was saying, it seems to not matter what you say, you can sort of draw a Christian idea to it. I think the most egregious example of where I think you're going wrong, Glen, respectfully, because that's what we're here to discuss, is where you think I'm going wrong, where I think you're going wrong, is summarized in your discussion of consent, wherein you quote 1 Corinthians, where Paul is giving quite a revolutionary claim in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he says that, firstly, he says a fairly standard thing for the Greco-Roman world, which is that women's bodies do not belong to them, but they belong to their husbands. But then he says his revolutionary thing, likewise, husbands, your bodies do not belong to you, they belong to your wives. And it seems extremely revolutionary. This is endemic. This is an archetype of what I'm trying to talk about. I'm willing to grant that is genuinely revolutionary and radical and progressive and brilliant for women.
Progressive to what?
Okay, progressive in the sociological sense of how people consider progressive values.
And brilliant,
right?
Yeah.
Yet, I would not want to overstate the case, which I believe you then go on to do, by saying that the very next thing that Paul says is verse 5 of chapter 7, where he says, after this authority of the bodies, he says, do not deprive one another, that is, sexually, except perhaps by agreement or mutual consent, is the translation you have in your book, for a set time to devote yourselves to prayer and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Paul says, and you quote this, Paul says that your bodies belong to each other. Do not restrict yourselves from each other sexually, except perhaps for a time of mutual consent. You then say, and look at how extraordinary it is that consent has been thrust into the bedroom and how revolutionary that is. But this to me read as such a sleight of hand. Because what did Paul just say? I mean, do you think that that's an example of consent being thrust into the bedroom, as you say in your book?
Yes, because your body does not belong to you alone.
But think about what Paul just said. Paul said that you are not to deprive each other sexually except by mutual consent. That is the only way that you're able to deprive your wife, or your wife can deprive you of sex, is by mutual consent. It's not consent to have sex, it's consent to not have sex, which means that if there is not mutual consent to not have sex, if I want to have sex with my wife and she doesn't want to have sex with me, well, we don't have the mutual consent to withdraw each other, so she still has to have sex with me. What do you call it when a man wants to have sex with his wife, she doesn't want to have sex with him, but she has to have sex with him anyway? I think there's a word for that.
Yeah.
That is what Paul is describing here.
That is not what
and
Paul is
to say
describing.
That is consent being thrust into the bedroom, I think, is a perfect example of the overstep
The wife's,
that I'm talking.
I think a can of worms has been opened here, so we might have to have a quick
The wife's body does not belong to her alone. The husband's body does not belong to him alone. And she therefore has the right to say, my body is, I have a right over your body.
To demand sex of him.
Not to have sex with me, right?
No.
You've got to read that in the context. It's both and. And I think what Paul is doing is encouraging husbands and wives towards sex and encouraging that trajectory towards sex, apart from take a break and get praying. But he's definitely pro-sex in those verses. But the wife, based on those very verses, can say, well, your body does not belong to you alone. I say no.
Yeah,
right?
and so the man can say, your body does not belong to you, it belongs to me. And the only reason that we can abstain from sex is by mutual consent. I don't consent to this abstention, so you have to have sex with me.
Yeah, I think that is the most suspicious reading, and unnecessarily suspicious
That's
reading.
what Paul says. He says, do not deprive each other except by mutual consent. He doesn't say, do not deprive each other unless one of you doesn't want to. He doesn't say, don't deprive each other sexually unless one of you says, you know what, I don't want to do this today. He says, do not deprive each other except by mutual consent, which means that you have to mutually consent to not have sex.
I think you're reading this as a logician, as though these are logical propositions that if and only if, like,
So what's
what's
Paul saying here then?
Well, I mean, Glen's reading obviously feels you've got a slightly tendentious reading of this to say that very specifically that I don't know. I don't know if we're going to get to the bottom of this.
He does say, I say this as means of concession, not as command, which is important. That's verse 6. That's what follows. But he's talking there about the fact that he'd rather they not be having sex at all. He'd rather they not be married and be celibate in the first place.
No. He's rather than married. If they are one flesh,
if
then
they
they
can't
need to be
control
one
their lusts
flesh.
for each other, then they should at
I
least get married.
suspect we probably need another go.
The reason I brought it up is to say that is the summary of my position in closing, is that what you have here is Paul saying, which for the time is extraordinary. He says that, wives' bodies belong to their husbands and husbands belong to their wives. And this is an extraordinary contribution that Christianity has made to the progressive elements of the Western tradition, sure. He then says that you should only refrain from having sex with each other by mutual consent, which is totally out of line with our modern conception of consent and has probably been a justification for marital rape until it was illegalized relatively recently. So Christianity has done a really good thing here, but it hasn't gone all the way, and we've needed other factors to come in to give us what is our modern conception of consent, which is not just this idea of bodily autonomy, but also the idea that my wife's body does not belong to me and mine does not belong to hers, but mine belongs to me and hers belongs to hers, and she can say no to sex for any reason whatsoever.
I think you're applying the mutual consent only to the prayer bit and not to the sex bit, and I think it applies to both. I think the rest of that chapter is the marriage and family program that has absolutely changed our moral sensibilities. And so, you've got Joseph Hendrick writing the Weirdest People in the World, saying that it's precisely that chapter, and together with Matthew 19, is the Christian sexual revolution that has completely upended our ideas of the human person and of the individual and of equality. And I don't think you get feminism of the kind of variety that we get without this intellectual genealogy. So it's a good...
Okay.
I think they would have done it anyway. I think those women would have...
They would have done that anyway. See, that's the untestable hypothesis, right? That is to say, we've had history A behind us. I'm going to tell another story, however unlikely that story is, And I think we would have gotten to here anyway via that other route. We haven't got to that other route.
I don't think it's that unlikely. And maybe I'm wrong, and maybe it's unfalsifiable or unprovable, but maybe that is just the nature of history. I mean, in the same, we were just talking about slavery and, why it is that in the Enlightenment, or around the time of the Enlightenment, Christianity does it again. Or maybe, once again, it's because slavery is also like economically necessary for so many societies, and around about the time that we start developing farming technologies that might allow us to do away with it, suddenly the abolition of slavery gets a lot easier.
I just think
it's a case of people asserting their own self-interest against oppressive systems and trying to protect
it from happening again. There were the economic arguments, and Napoleon said, no, actually slavery is good for the economy, and so back it comes. Was he wrong to bring back slavery because it was good? He claimed that it was good for human flourishing.
Whether it was right or wrong is separate from the question of whether it was indebted to Christianity. And that's the very point.
We're going to call time, and I have absolutely enjoyed this conversation. There's another whole conversation that we were trying to move towards, but I think we're going to leave.
I'm sorry I didn't do the emotions. I'm not trying to run away from that. I just thought that this was more important.
You're running away, but you wanted to nail this issue. Maybe come back and we'll talk emotivism.
We can do that,
because that would be fun, and we could maybe move from this historical arguments to a more philosophical argument about the grounding.
I guess I just wanted to keep it synthesized.
I get that.
I'm sorry for sort of.
No,
I tried to answer it briefly.
I just really appreciate the clarity you both brought to both of your positions. We asked you to come here to test Glen's hypothesis. You've done that brilliantly, Alex. Glen, I think you've done a wonderful job of pushing back and questioning Alex's assumptions as well. Maybe as we finish, just again, we call this show On Common Ground.
Yes.
There's been a certain amount of, common ground shared, a lot of uncommon ground as well. If this isn't too twee, I wonder maybe if, Alex, you could give a sense of what's been helpful from today's conversation, what perhaps you can take away as saying, okay, there's something I'm glad that Glen presented and helped me to clarify my ideas on these issues.
I think clarifying what the specific thesis is, in particular, I know you didn't so much focus on this today, but in your book as well, the idea that it's not this thesis that everything which is good in the West is Christian, and everything that's bad is something else, or it's satanic or pagan. It's like Christianity can sort of own the tradition as a whole, and that it's neutral as to whether it's good or bad. But I really appreciate today the sort of emphasis on the revolutionary change that Jesus makes, and that how the Old Testament doesn't stand alone, and it's part of a narrative tradition. Of course, I still have my issues with that, but I think it's important to clarify. And also that it's not a case of just saying, like, if you want to find Western civilization, it's written in the Bible. Because, of course, I agree with that, and it's a criticism I can make.
I don't think that's what Glen is saying.
Exactly. It's really helpful to say, like, I don't think you can do that, like, either, it seems, but that's not really what the thesis is about. And I think that brings clarity to a thesis, which I think is caricatured online a lot. Oh, everything that's good in the West is Christian. I don't think that's what you're saying, and I think it's really helpful to hear it more precisely, but especially how you flesh it out in the examples. I think the structure of these particular values is really helpful, and is a good sort of steel man of the case.
Thank you. Glen, anything that you found particularly helpful from Alex's perspective today?
Yes, I was, as I said at the beginning, sort of expecting to be taken to the Bible, and I really appreciated that. I really appreciate. I think the Bible is magnificent. I think a true and careful study of it will always be for the good, and so. Yeah, I'm going to go back and think very, very much harder about 1 Corinthians 7. I'm going to go back and think harder about, where was that? The Exodus...
Exodus 22:29.
22:29.
I think it's easy to say that that's not... I think it probably was, but it's easy enough to say that it's not, but it's interesting.
But I think, I think stress testing the hypothesis, and this is one way of doing it. And I think also being challenged to think around the falsifiable question. What would it take to falsify the hypothesis? I've thought about that quite a bit, and whether it's even something that can be done or should be done. Is it that kind of a hypothesis? Are we in that kind of realm to think that through? But I think that gets us to a really and I think a really helpful reminder from Alex, Hippocratic Oath, and there are other sources of or there are other examples of the kinds of values that we really prize, and never want to be heard to say, "Don't look at the Good Samaritan; he's a Samaritan." I think that's a really important fleshing out of the thesis too.
Well, thank you. I hope this won't be the last time we get to do something like this between you. I think it's been brilliant, and perhaps we could do, at some point, a round two where we delve into the philosophical underpinnings.
We didn't do
well
science
of all this, and there's science. There's several more
time.
chapters
Next time.
that we could go to in this whole area. But for now, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Glenn, for joining me.
Thank
More than
you.
welcome.